Hey guys, tonight we take you deep into the Brazilian wilderness, where life was so hard that most of us wouldn't survive a single day. It's Colonial Brazil, a place of endless forests, dangerous animals, and people doing whatever it took to stay alive. In one of the toughest places on earth, so before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy these stories. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see our community from all around the world. Now maybe dim your lights, grab a comfortable pillow, and let's drift into tonight's journey through Colonial Brazil together. The sun wasn't even up yet when João opened his eyes. It was still dark outside, but he could already hear people moving around. 500 people lived and worked at this sugar plantation, and João was the boss of all of them. Well, not the real boss. That was the rich owner who lived in the big house. But João was the one who told everyone what to do every single day. You might think being the boss sounds easy, but João's job was harder than you can imagine. Every morning, he had to figure out what 500 different people would do that day. Some people cut sugar cane in the fields. Others fed the cane into big machines that squeezed out the sweet juice. Some people boiled the juice in huge pots until it turned into sugar. And some people had to fix things when they broke, which happened all the time. João lived in a small room above the sugar mill. The mill was a big building with enormous wooden wheels that turned round and round, crushing the sugar cane. The wheels were so big that oxen had to walk in circles all day to make them turn. João could hear the creaking and groaning of the wheels even when he was trying to sleep. Before he even got dressed, João was thinking about problems. Yesterday, one of the mill workers hurt his leg when he got too close to the grinding wheels. Now that worker couldn't do his regular job. João had to find someone else to take his place. But everyone already had their own jobs to do. It was like a giant puzzle where moving one piece meant everything else had to move too. The sugar plantation was like a small town. There were fields of sugar cane that went on as far as you could see. There were houses where the workers lived, though houses might be too nice a word for the tiny huts made of mud and straw. There was a chapel where everyone had to go to church on Sundays. There was a blacksmith shop where they made and fixed tools. There was even a small hospital where they tried to help people when they got sick, though the medicines back then weren't very good. João put on his clothes and walked outside. The air was thick and humid, like breathing through a wet blanket. This was Brazil in the 1680s, when the Portuguese had been living there for almost 200 years, but it still felt like a wild, dangerous place to most Europeans. The coast where this plantation sat was the only part that really felt safe to the colonists. Beyond the hills, there were vast forests full of indigenous people who didn't want Europeans on their land. As João walked through the plantation, he started making his mental list for the day. The sugar harvest season was in full swing, which meant everyone had to work extra hard. During harvest time, the mill never stopped. Workers took turns so that the grinding wheels kept turning day and night. If they stopped the mill for too long, the sugar juice would start to go bad, and all their work would be wasted. The plantation grew nothing but sugar cane, which meant they had to buy all their food from other places. Ships came from Portugal, bringing things like wheat flour, olive oil, and wine. Other ships came from other parts of Brazil, bringing dried meat and beans. If a ship was late, or if pirates attacked it, people on the plantation could go hungry. João knew that the workers were already tired, and it was only the middle of harvest season. They worked from sunrise to sunset every day except Sunday. On Sunday, they had to go to church in the morning, but at least they got the afternoon to rest. Some workers were slaves brought from Africa. Others were indigenous people who had been forced to work on the plantation. A few were poor Portuguese colonists who had no other choice but to work for almost nothing. The sugar plantation was like a machine, and João was the person who had to keep all the parts working together. If the cane cutters didn't cut enough cane, the mill workers had nothing to do. If the mill broke down, the cane would pile up and rot. If the people who boiled the sugar juice worked too slowly, everything would get backed up. And if anything went wrong, it was João who would get blamed. But here's the thing that would surprise you most. For all the power João had over 500 people's daily lives, he was still just a worker himself. He couldn't leave the plantation without permission. He couldn't make big decisions about what to plant or how much to pay the workers. The real owner of the plantation lived in a mansion and only visited once in a while to count his money. João had all the responsibility, but very little of the reward. As the sun started to rise, João began his daily walk around the plantation. This wasn't a relaxing morning stroll. It was more like a military inspection. He had to check on everything and everyone before the day's work really got started. First, he went to the slave quarters. These were long, low buildings where most of the workers slept. The buildings had no windows, just small holes in the walls for air. Inside, people slept on wooden boards, with maybe a thin blanket if they were lucky. João counted heads to make. Sure, no one had tried to escape during the night. Running away was always a risk, especially for the slaves who had been brought from Africa against their will. João wasn't cruel like some overseers, but he also wasn't kind. He couldn't afford to be. The plantation owner expected certain things, and if João didn't deliver, he would be replaced by someone who might be much worse. So João had to find a balance between keeping the workers alive and healthy enough to work, while also making sure they produced enough sugar to satisfy the owner. Next, he checked the mill. The big wooden wheels were already turning, powered by 6 oxen walking in an endless circle. The oxen wore leather blinders so they couldn't see where they were going. If they could see, they might get dizzy from walking in circles all day and refuse to work. A young boy sat on top of one of the oxen, carrying a long stick to poke them if they slowed down. The mill was dangerous. Workers had to feed sugarcane stalks between the huge grinding wheels. If someone wasn't careful, their hand could get caught and crushed. This happened more often than you might think. There was even a special axe hanging near the mill, not for cutting wood, but for cutting off someone's arm if it got stuck in the wheels. It was better to lose an arm than to be pulled into the machine and die. João watched the workers for a few minutes. They moved like dancers who had practiced the same routine 1,000 times. Grab a stalk of cane, feed it into the wheels, grab another stalk, feed it in. The sweet juice flowed down into big wooden troughs, while the crushed cane stalks piled up on the other side. From the mill, the sugar juice went to the boiling house. This building was always hot and steamy, even hotter than the already hot Brazilian weather. Inside were 5 enormous copper pots, each one big enough for a person to hide in. The pots sat over fires that burned all day and night. Making sugar wasn't as simple as just boiling cane juice. The workers had to know exactly when to move the juice from one pot to the next. They had to know when to add lime to make the sugar crystals form properly. They had to know when the sugar was ready to pour into wooden molds to harden. If they got any of this wrong, weeks of work could be ruined. The workers in the boiling house were usually the most skilled on the whole plantation. They were like chefs, except instead of making food taste good, they were making sugar that would be shipped to Europe and sold for lots of money. These workers often stayed up all night, testing the sugar by taste and smell, and the way it looked when they dropped it into cold water. João continued his inspection. He checked the cane fields where dozens of workers were already cutting stalks, with large knives called machetes. Cutting sugar cane was back-breaking work. The stalks were taller than a person and had to be cut close to the ground where the sugar was sweetest. Workers bent over all day in the hot sun, cutting and collecting the heavy stalks. He checked the carpenter's workshop, where workers fixed broken tools and built new boxes for shipping sugar. He checked the blacksmith shop, where they made the iron parts for the mill and sharpened the machetes. He even checked the plantation's small church, making sure it was ready for the daily morning prayer that all workers had to attend. But João's biggest worry wasn't any single building or group of workers. His biggest worry was something he couldn't see: disease. In colonial Brazil, diseases could spread through a plantation like wildfire. Yellow fever, smallpox, dysentery. Any of these could kill dozens of workers in just a few weeks. And if that happened, there wasn't really a way to replace them quickly. The plantation was far from any big town. The nearest city, Salvador, was a 3-day journey by ox cart. If they needed new workers, supplies, or help with anything, it took time to get it. This is why every plantation had to be almost completely self-sufficient. They grew some of their own food, made their own tools, and even had their own priest to perform marriages and funerals. As João finished his morning inspection, he started thinking about the bigger problems that kept him awake at night. The plantation made a lot of sugar, but all of that sugar had to get to Europe somehow. Ships carrying sugar were favorite targets for pirates. Just last month, they heard that a ship carrying sugar from a nearby plantation had been attacked. The sailors were killed, the sugar was stolen, and months of work were lost. Even if the sugar made it safely to Europe, there was no guarantee it would sell for a good price. Too much sugar arriving at once could drive prices down. War between European countries could block trade routes. A bad storm could sink ships in the harbour. But perhaps the biggest problem was one that João tried not to think about too much. The whole system depended on keeping people enslaved and forcing them to work against their will. Deep down, João knew this was wrong, but it was all he had ever known. It was how his father had lived, and his grandfather before him. The entire colony of Brazil was built on this system, and one plantation overseer couldn't change that, even if he wanted to. By mid-morning, João was already exhausted, but his day was just beginning. He had to meet with the plantation owner, Dom Fernando, who had arrived unexpectedly from Salvador. Dom Fernando lived in luxury in the city most of the time, only visiting the plantation when he wanted to check on his investment or when there were problems that needed his personal attention. Dom Fernando was a tall, thin man who always wore fancy clothes that looked completely out of place on a hot, dusty plantation. He had inherited this land from his father and had never actually done any physical work in his life. To him, the plantation was just numbers on paper. So many tons of sugar, so much profit, so many expenses. "João," Dom Fernando said as they met in the plantation's main office, "I've been looking at the books. Production is down from last month. What's the problem?" João had been dreading this conversation. "Sir, we lost 4 workers to fever last week, and the rains came early this year, which damaged some of the cane fields. We're doing our best, but—" "I don't want excuses," Dom Fernando interrupted. "I want results. My friends' plantations are producing more sugar than ever. Why isn't mine?" This was the trap that João lived in every day. Dom Fernando saw only the final numbers. He didn't see Domingo limping around on his injured leg, still trying to work because he was afraid of being punished. He didn't see the workers staying up all night in the boiling house, their eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep. He didn't see the children as young as 8 years old carrying water to the field workers under the burning sun. João explained about the broken equipment, the sick workers, and the damaged crops. Dom Fernando listened with the expression of someone hearing disappointing news about the weather. Finally, he said, "Well, fix it. That's what I pay you for. But here's what." Dom Fernando didn't understand. You can't just fix people being exhausted. You can't just fix tropical diseases. You can't just fix equipment that breaks down because it's being used 20 hours a day in terrible conditions. After Dom Fernando left in his fancy carriage, João felt more alone than ever. He walked back through the plantation, seeing it through different eyes now. He noticed how thin some of the workers looked. He noticed the patches in the roof of the slave quarters where rain leaked through. He noticed how the youngest children had stopped playing games and just sat quietly in whatever shade they could find. That afternoon brought a new crisis. A fight broke out in the cane fields between 2 workers. One was an African slave named Kwame, who had been working on the plantation for 5 years. The other was a new arrival from Portugal named Miguel, a poor man who had come to Brazil hoping to make his fortune, but ended up working for almost nothing. The fight started because Miguel accused Kwame of not working hard enough. Kwame, who had been cutting cane since before sunrise, didn't take kindly to this criticism from someone who had only been on the plantation for 2 weeks. Soon they were rolling around in the dirt, fighting with their machetes dangerously close. João had to break up the fight, but more importantly, he had to figure out the punishment. If he was too lenient, it might encourage more fighting. If he was too harsh, it could cause even bigger problems. Some overseers would have had both men whipped publicly as an example to others, but João knew that angry, resentful workers were less productive than workers who felt they were being treated fairly. In the end, he decided that both men would work an extra hour each day for a week, but they would work in different parts of the plantation so they wouldn't see each other. It wasn't the harshest punishment possible, but it wasn't nothing either. As evening approached, João finally had a few minutes to himself. He sat outside his quarters and watched the sun set over the cane fields. The plantation never really slept. Workers in the mill and boiling house would continue through the night, but things did get a little quieter after dark. João thought about his own life. He was 42 years old and had spent his entire adult life managing this plantation. He had never married because he never had time to court a woman properly. He had no children of his own, though he had watched hundreds of children grow up on the plantation, many of whom would never know any life except this one. Sometimes he wondered what would happen if he just left. He had saved a little money over the years. Maybe he could buy a small plot of land somewhere and grow food for himself instead of sugar for rich Europeans. But he also knew that Dom Fernando would hunt him down if he tried to leave. Overseers weren't slaves, but they weren't completely free either. As he sat there in the growing darkness, João heard the sound of singing coming from the slave quarters. It was a song in a language he didn't understand, probably something from Africa that the older slaves had taught the younger ones. The melody was sad, but also somehow hopeful. João realized something that night that he had never really thought about before. He was just as trapped as everyone else on the plantation, just in a different way. The slaves were trapped by chains and whips. The poor Portuguese workers were trapped by debt and lack of options, and he was trapped by responsibility and fear. The next morning, João would wake up before dawn again. He would make his inspection, rounds again. He would solve the same kinds of problems all over again, and the great machine of the sugar plantation would keep grinding away, turning human labor into sweet crystals that would end up in European coffee cups and desserts. But for one moment, sitting in the darkness and listening to that mysterious song, João understood something important about colonial Brazil. Everyone was surviving as best they could in a system that was bigger and more powerful than any individual person. Even the plantation owners like Dom Fernando were trapped in their own way, dependent on a system they couldn't really control. The sugar plantation would continue operating for another 100 years before slavery was finally abolished in Brazil. By then, João would be long dead, his name forgotten by history. But for over 20 years, he held together a small piece of the Portuguese Empire, managing the daily lives of 500 human beings in ways that would be almost impossible to imagine. Today, Antonio da Silva had walked so far that he had worn through 2 pairs of boots and was now walking barefoot like the indigenous guides who led his group. It was 1695, and he was somewhere in the mountains of what would later be called Minas Gerais, a place so remote that no European had set foot there just 5 years earlier. Along with 30 other men, Antonio was looking for something that had driven people crazy for centuries: gold. You might wonder why anyone would walk 1,000 miles through dangerous wilderness just to look for shiny rocks. But in Antonio's time, finding gold wasn't just about getting rich, it was about survival. Antonio had been a poor farmer in Portugal who could barely feed his family. When news reached his village that gold had been discovered in Brazil, he sold everything he owned to pay for passage on a ship to the New World. The journey to the goldfields wasn't like following a map to a destination. There were no roads, no inns, no places to buy food or supplies. Antonio's group had started their walk from the coast near Rio de Janeiro, and they had been walking for 3 months. They followed indigenous trails that wound through thick forests, over mountains, and across rivers that had no bridges. Each man in the group carried about 60 pounds of supplies on his back. This included tools for digging and washing gold, food that wouldn't spoil like dried meat and beans, gunpowder for protection, and trade goods to exchange with indigenous people they might meet. They also carried basic medical supplies, though. These were mostly useless: a bottle of alcohol, some prayers written on paper, and a few herbs that were supposed to cure fever. Antonio had joined up with this particular group because their leader, a man named Captain Borba, claimed to know where they were going. Borba had supposedly been to the gold region before and had brought back enough gold to buy a house in Rio. But as the weeks went by, Antonio began to suspect that Borba was as lost as the rest of them. The group included all kinds of men. There were a few Portuguese colonists like Antonio who had come to Brazil hoping for a better life. There were mixed-race men called Mamelucos who knew how to survive in the wilderness. There were even a few freed slaves who hoped that finding gold might let them buy freedom for their families. What they all had in common was desperation and a willingness to risk everything for the chance of striking it rich. Walking through the Brazilian interior in 1695 was incredibly dangerous. There were indigenous groups who didn't appreciate strangers walking through their territory with weapons and digging tools. Some of these groups were friendly and willing to trade, but others would attack without warning. Antonio's group had already lost 2 men to arrows during a surprise attack 3 weeks earlier. But indigenous people weren't the only danger. The forest itself was trying to kill them. There were poisonous snakes that could bite you before you even saw them. There were jaguars that followed the group at night, just outside the circle of firelight. There were insects that carried diseases nobody could cure. And there were plants that looked harmless but would make you sick if you touched them. The worst part was the uncertainty. Nobody really knew where they were going or how much farther they had to walk. Captain Borba kept saying they were getting close, but he had been saying that for weeks. Some of the men wanted to turn back, but they had already come so far that returning to the coast would be almost as dangerous as continuing forward. Food was becoming a serious problem. They had planned for a 2-month journey, but it had already been 3 months and they still hadn't found any gold. They were rationing their dried meat and beans carefully, eating just enough to keep walking. Some days they were lucky enough to catch fish or birds, but other days they went to sleep with empty stomachs. Antonio often thought about his wife and children back in Portugal. When he left, he had promised to return within 2 years as a rich man. Now he was starting to wonder if he would return at all. Every day, their situation became more desperate, but every day they also got closer to either finding gold or dying in the attempt. The thing that kept Antonio going was the stories. Around the campfire at night, the men told stories about other gold hunters who had struck it rich. They talked about valleys where gold nuggets lay scattered on the ground like pebbles. They talked about rivers where you could pan for gold and fill a pouch in just 1 day. These stories might have been true, or they might have been lies that desperate. Men told each other to keep hope alive. But Antonio had seen proof that gold existed in Brazil. Before leaving Rio, he had met a man who had found a gold nugget the size of a chicken egg. The man had been afraid to show it to too many people because he didn't want to be robbed, but he had shown it to Antonio. Holding that heavy, gleaming rock in his hands, Antonio knew that somewhere in the Brazilian wilderness there were more nuggets waiting to be found. The group was now following a river that flowed north through increasingly mountainous terrain. The water was clear and cold, which Captain Borba said was a good sign. Gold was often found in rivers like this, washed down from mountains over thousands of years. But they needed to find exactly the right spot, a place where the river slowed, down enough for gold to settle in the sand and gravel. As Antonio walked along the riverbank, his bare feet stepping carefully on the smooth stones, he tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. He tried not to think about the men they had already buried along the trail. He tried not to think about his dwindling supplies or the strange fever that had started making some of the men delirious at night. Instead, he focused on putting one foot in front of the other, following the river that might lead to fortune or death. In colonial Brazil, those two possibilities often seemed to be the same thing. On the 97th day of their journey, everything changed. João Lobo, one of the younger men in the group, was refilling his water bottle at the river when he noticed something glinting in the shallow water. At first, he thought it was just quartz or mica, the kind of shiny rocks that had fooled them many times before. But when he reached down and picked it up, his hands started shaking. "Captain!" João shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "Captain, come quickly!" Captain Borba hurried over, followed by Antonio and several other men. When João opened his hand, they all saw it, a piece of gold the size of a grape, worn smooth by the flowing water. For a moment, nobody spoke. They just stared at the small, heavy object that represented everything they had suffered for. Then chaos erupted. Men started splashing into the river, scooping up handfuls of sand and gravel, searching desperately for more gold. Some men began arguing about who would get to pan for gold in the best spots. Others started claiming sections of the riverbank as their own territory. Captain Borba fired his musket into the air to get everyone's attention. "Calm down," he shouted. "If we fight each other, we'll all lose. There's enough river for everyone." But Antonio could see that this was just the beginning of their problems. Finding gold was one thing. Figuring out what to do with it was something else entirely. They were still hundreds of miles from the nearest Portuguese settlement. They had very few supplies left. And now that they had actually found gold, they would have to protect it from anyone who might want to steal it. The next few weeks were like a strange dream. The men set up a temporary camp by the river and began the backbreaking work of gold mining. This wasn't the easy treasure hunting they had imagined. Panning for gold meant crouching by the river for hours, washing pan after pan of sand and gravel, looking for the tiny specks of yellow metal mixed in with worthless dirt. Antonio learned that there were two main ways to search for gold in a river. The first was panning, filling a circular metal pan with sand from the riverbed, then carefully washing it with water while swirling the pan in a special way. The heavier gold would sink to the bottom while the lighter sand and rocks washed away. It took skill and patience, and most pans came up empty. The second method was building a simple wooden contraption called a sluice box. This was like a long wooden tray with ridges on the bottom. You'd shovel sand and water into one end, and as the water flowed through the box, the gold would get caught behind the ridges, while everything else washed away. A sluice box could process more sand than panning, but it took time and materials to build one. The men worked from sunrise to sunset, their hands becoming cracked and bleeding from constantly being in cold water. They found gold almost every day, but not very much. Some days, a man might find only enough tiny flakes to cover his thumbnail. Other days, someone might find a nugget the size of a bean, which would make everyone else wildly jealous. Antonio discovered that mining for gold was nothing like the stories people told. There were no valleys where gold nuggets lay scattered on the ground. There were no rivers where you could fill a pouch in a single day. Finding gold was slow, difficult work that left you exhausted and dirty. Your back ached from bending over pans all day. Your eyes strained from looking for tiny flakes of yellow in handfuls of grey sand. But the hardest part wasn't the physical work. It was dealing with the other men. As the days passed and everyone's small pouches of gold grew heavier, trust began to break down. Men started sleeping with their gold tied around their waists. They became suspicious of anyone who seemed to be finding more gold than they were. Arguments broke out over the best mining spots. The group also faced a serious decision. Should they stay and continue mining, or should they head back to civilization with what they had found? They had been gone for almost 4 months, and their supplies were nearly exhausted. But the gold they had found wasn't enough to make any of them rich. It was enough to improve their lives, but not enough to justify all the suffering they had endured. Captain Borba argued for staying longer. "We've found the mother lode," he insisted. "If we leave now, other men will come and take our gold." But Antonio wasn't so sure. Winter was approaching, and winter in the mountains meant cold that could kill. Their clothes were falling apart. Several men had developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. The decision was made for them when they encountered another group of gold hunters. These men had been traveling from a different direction and had obviously been mining for longer. Their equipment was better, and they seemed to know exactly what they were doing. The leader of this group, a grizzled man named Silva, explained that they weren't the first ones to find this river. There are already 3 other groups mining upstream, Silver told them, and 2 more groups coming up from the south. You found gold, yes, but you didn't find a secret. Within a year, there will be hundreds of men working this river. This news hit them like a splash of cold water. They had thought they were pioneers, the first Europeans to discover this golden river, but they were just a small part of a much larger rush. Soon, this remote wilderness would be crowded with gold hunters, all competing for the same limited treasure. Antonio made his decision that night. He packed his gold, about 2 ounces that he had collected over 3 weeks of work, and prepared to leave. Several other men made the same choice. They would head back to the coast, sell their gold, and try to live better lives with the modest profit they had made. But some men chose to stay, including Captain Borba. The fever of gold hunting had gotten into their blood. They couldn't bear the thought of leaving when there might be more gold just waiting to be found. Antonio shook hands with these men, knowing he would probably never see them again. The journey back to the coast was almost as difficult as the journey into the interior had been. But now Antonio was traveling with a smaller group, which made them faster but also more vulnerable to attack. They had to be constantly alert for bandits who might have heard about the gold discoveries and were waiting to rob returning miners. As they walked back through the same forests and mountains they had crossed months earlier, Antonio had time to think about what they had accomplished. They had proven that there was gold in the Brazilian interior, but more importantly, they had opened a door that could never be closed again. Soon, thousands of people would pour into those mountains, and the face of Brazil would change forever. The return journey took 2 months, and by the time Antonio reached Rio de Janeiro, he barely recognized the city he had left 6 months earlier. The sleepy colonial port had been transformed into a bustling center of activity. Ships arrived daily, bringing new waves of gold hunters from Portugal, Spain, and other parts of Brazil. The streets were crowded with men buying supplies for their own journeys into the interior. Antonio went directly to a goldsmith shop to sell his gold. The goldsmith, a Portuguese man named Costa, examined each small nugget and flake with a jeweler's lens before weighing them on a precise scale. The final amount was exactly what Antonio had estimated, just over 2 ounces of gold. "This is good. Quality gold," Costa told him. "Very pure. Where did you find it?" Antonio was careful not to give too much detail about the location. Even though he knew other miners were already working the river, he still felt protective of the secret. Costa paid him in Portuguese coins, enough money to live comfortably for about 2 years, but far from the fortune Antonio had dreamed of. Outside the goldsmith shop, Antonio stood in the busy street and tried to process what he had been through. 6 months ago, he had been a desperate farmer with nothing to lose. Now, he was a man with enough money to start a small business or buy a plot of good farmland. It wasn't the incredible wealth he had imagined, but it was more than he had ever possessed before. But something had changed inside Antonio during those months in the wilderness. He had seen men die from disease and violence. He had watched friendships dissolve over tiny flakes of metal. He had learned that the promise of easy wealth often led to harder suffering than honest poverty. Most importantly, he had witnessed the beginning of something that would transform Brazil forever. Word about the gold discoveries was spreading like wildfire. In the taverns, Antonio heard stories that grew more fantastic with each telling. Men claimed to have found nuggets the size of bread loaves. Others spoke of entire mountainsides covered with gold veins. Some stories were probably true, but many were clearly lies told by men trying to convince others to finance their expeditions. Antonio decided to use his gold money to open a small shop selling supplies to gold hunters. He rented a building near the docks and filled it with pickaxes, metal pans, dried food, and sturdy clothing. Business was immediate and profitable. Every day, dozens of men came in to buy what they needed for their journeys into the interior. From these customers, Antonio learned what was really happening in the gold regions. The easy gold, the nuggets lying in stream beds that could be picked up by hand, was being found quickly. Now miners were having to dig deeper and work harder for smaller amounts. Some areas were becoming violent as groups fought over the best mining claims. More importantly, the gold rush was creating entire towns almost overnight. Places that had been empty wilderness just months before now had populations of thousands. These new settlements had names like Villa Rica and Mariana. They needed everything that civilized people needed: food, tools, clothing, medicine, and even entertainment. The Portuguese government was trying to catch up with these rapid changes. They were sending soldiers and tax collectors to the gold regions, determined to claim their share of the wealth. Anyone who found gold would have to pay a tax to the crown. Anyone who tried to smuggle gold out of Brazil would face severe punishment. Antonio met other men who had returned from the gold fields, and their stories varied dramatically. Some had found enough gold to buy estates and live like noblemen. Others had found nothing and returned poorer than when they left. Many never returned at all. They either died in the wilderness or decided to stay and continue searching. One customer, an older man named Rodriguez, had made 3 trips to the EZ gold regions. He bought supplies from Antonio while telling stories of what he had seen. The first year, it was like paradise, Rodriguez said. Gold everywhere, and enough space for everyone to work. But now it's chaos. Men killing each other over claims. Prices for food so high that some miners spend more on beans and rice than they earn from gold. And the diseases: malaria, yellow fever, smallpox. Sometimes entire camps just disappear. As months passed, Antonio began to understand that he had been part of something much bigger than just a search for gold. The Brazilian gold rush would bring hundreds of thousands of people into the interior of the continent. It would create new cities, new trade routes, and new social classes. It would also bring slavery on a massive scale, as plantation owners bought African slaves to work in the gold mines. The gold rush would make some people incredibly wealthy, especially those who sold supplies to miners or controlled the trade routes. But for most individual gold hunters, the dream of easy wealth remained just that, a dream. For every man who struck it rich, dozens struggled to find enough gold to pay for their basic needs. Antonio's shop prospered because he understood something that many gold hunters didn't. In a gold rush, the people who sell picks and shovels often do better than the people who dig for gold. By the end of his first year in business, Antonio had earned more money than he had made from his own gold mining. But sometimes, late at night when his shop was closed and the city was quiet, Antonio would think about the men he had left behind at that river in the mountains. Were they still there? Still searching for the big strike that would make them rich? Had they found more gold? Or had they given up and moved on to other rivers, other dreams? Antonio never returned to the gold fields himself, though he was tempted many times. He had learned an important lesson. Sometimes, the real treasure isn't the thing you're looking for, but the knowledge you gain while looking for it. He had seen how quickly a man could lose everything chasing after a dream. He had also seen how quickly an entire country could change when thousands of people shared the same dream. Years later, when Antonio was an old man, he would tell his grandchildren about the time he walked 1,000 miles through the wilderness to find shiny rocks in a river. By then, the Brazilian gold rush had run its course. The easy gold was gone, and the boom towns had either grown into real cities or been abandoned to the jungle. But those few years in the 1690s had changed Brazil forever. The gold discoveries had shifted the center of the colony from the sugar plantations of the coast to the mining regions of the interior. They had brought enormous wealth to Portugal and made Brazil one of the most important colonies in the world. And it had all started with desperate men like Antonio, willing to walk 1,000 miles through danger and hardship for the chance to hold a few ounces of metal that caught the sunlight just right. Father Francisco de Lima had been walking for 6 weeks through the Brazilian wilderness, and his leather shoes had long since fallen apart. Now he walked barefoot, like the indigenous guides who led him deeper into territory that no European missionary had ever seen. His destination was a Guarani village somewhere along the Paraguay River, where he planned to build a mission and teach people about Christianity. But first, he had to survive the journey. It was 1680, and Father Francisco was part of the Jesuit order, priests who specialized in going to the most remote and dangerous places in the world to spread their faith. The Jesuits were known for their intelligence and their willingness to learn local languages and customs. Unlike many other Europeans, they didn't just try to force their own culture on indigenous people. Instead, they tried to find ways to blend Christianity with local traditions. Father Francisco carried very few possessions in his worn leather bag. He had a Bible written in Latin, which he could barely read in the dim firelight of evening camps. He had paper and ink for writing, though the humid jungle air made the ink run and the paper stick together. He had some basic medical supplies, really just some herbs and a bottle of alcohol. And most importantly, he had wooden blocks with letters carved into them, which he planned to use for teaching reading and writing. You might wonder why a priest would think that teaching the alphabet was just as important as teaching about God. But Father Francisco understood something that many Europeans didn't. To really convert people to Christianity, you had to communicate with them in their own language. And to preserve that communication for future generations, you had to teach people to read and write. The Jesuit approach was different from other missionary groups. Instead of simply demanding that indigenous people abandon all their old ways, the Jesuits studied local cultures carefully. They learned indigenous languages and translated Christian prayers and stories into those languages. They even incorporated some local customs into Christian ceremonies, as long as those customs didn't conflict with basic Christian beliefs. Father Francisco's guides were two Guarani men named Ayala and Keiko, who had already been converted to Christianity by other Jesuits. They spoke Portuguese as well as their native language, and they were leading Father Francisco to their home village, where the people had expressed interest in learning about the European religion. The journey was incredibly difficult. They walked through thick jungle where the humidity was so heavy you felt like you were breathing water. They crossed rivers by clinging to fallen logs or swimming while holding their supplies above their heads. They climbed mountains where the thin air made them dizzy and weak. And always, they had to be alert for dangers, poisonous snakes, wild animals, and indigenous groups who might not be as friendly as their guides. At night, they slept on the ground around a small fire, listening to the sounds of the jungle. Father Francisco often lay awake thinking about the enormity of his task. He was trying to teach complex religious ideas to people who had never heard of Europe, who had never seen a book, who organized their entire lives around completely different beliefs about the world. But Father Francisco had been preparing for this mission for years. Before coming to Brazil, he had studied in Rome, learning not just theology, but also practical skills like basic medicine, agriculture, and even carpentry. The Jesuits believed that missionaries needed to be useful to the communities they served, not just preachers who expected to be fed and housed while contributing nothing practical. During the long walk, Ayala and Keiko taught Father Francisco basic words in Guarani. He practiced constantly, repeating phrases until he could say them without thinking. Simple things like hello, water, food, and friend. He also tried to learn the sounds of Guarani, which included some sounds that didn't exist in Portuguese or Latin. In return, Father Francisco taught his guides to read simple Portuguese words. Using his wooden letter blocks, he showed them how letters combine to make sounds, and how sounds combine to make words. It was slow work. Ayala caught on quickly, but Keiko struggled with the concept that these strange marks on paper could represent the sounds of speech. As they got closer to their destination, Father Francisco began to feel nervous. What if the villagers changed their minds about wanting a missionary? What if they decided he was a threat to their traditional ways? What if he couldn't learn their language well enough to explain Christianity in a way they could understand? The Guarani village, when they finally reached it, was larger than Father Francisco had expected. About 300 people lived in long houses made of wood and palm leaves. The village was surrounded by gardens where the people grew corn, beans, and squash. There were also areas where they raised small animals and kept bees for honey. The village chief, an elderly man named Tao, greeted Father Francisco with curiosity, but also with caution. Through Ayala's translation, Tao explained that his people had been discussing this visit for months. Some villagers were excited about learning new things from the European. Others worried that accepting a foreign priest might anger their traditional spirits. Father Francisco understood that he was walking into a delicate situation. These people had their own complex religious beliefs that had sustained them for generations. They worshipped nature spirits, honored their ancestors, and had their own explanations for how the world worked. He couldn't simply tell them that everything they believed was wrong. Instead, he would need to find connections between their beliefs and Christianity. Maybe their nature spirits could be understood as angels. Maybe their respect for ancestors could be connected to the Christian saints. It would take time, patience, and careful study of their culture. Chief Tao gave Father Francisco permission to stay in the village for 3 months to see how things went. If the arrangement worked well for both sides, he could stay longer and perhaps even build a proper mission with a church and a school. If not, he would be asked to leave peacefully. Father Francisco was given a small house at the edge of the village. It was nothing more than a wooden frame with palm leaf walls and roof, but it was dry and comfortable. More importantly, it was located where villagers could visit him easily, but where he wouldn't be constantly in the middle of village business. On his first evening in the village, Father Francisco sat outside his house and watched the daily life of the community. Children played games that involved running and jumping. Women worked together preparing corn for the evening meal. Men sat in groups discussing the day's hunting and fishing. It was a peaceful, organized society with its own rhythms and traditions. As he watched, Father Francisco realized that his real mission wouldn't be just teaching these people about Christianity. It would be learning enough about their way of life to bridge the gap between two completely different worlds. Father Francisco's first month in the village was more difficult than he had expected. Learning Guarani was like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. Every day he sat with different villagers, pointing at objects and repeating words until his throat was sore. The children were the best teachers. They laughed when he said things wrong, but they were patient about correcting him. The biggest challenge wasn't the language itself, but understanding how the Guarani people thought about the world. Their language had concepts that didn't exist in Portuguese or Latin. For example, they had different words for we, depending on whether the listener was included or not. They had verb forms that indicated whether the speaker had seen something happen, or had only heard about it from someone else. Father Francisco started his teaching by focusing on practical things rather than religion. He showed the villagers how to write their own names using his wooden letter blocks. This was fascinating to them because their culture had been entirely oral. All their history, stories, and knowledge were passed down by speaking and memory, never by writing. A young man named Pira was the first to really understand how writing worked. When Father Francisco showed him how the marks on paper could represent the sounds of his name, Pira's eyes lit up with understanding. Within a week, Pira could write not just his own name, but the names of his family members. Soon, other young people wanted to learn this mysterious skill too. Teaching reading was harder than teaching writing. Father Francisco had to create simple books in Guarani, but first he had to fully understand the language himself. He spent hours with the village elders, learning their stories and trying to write them down. Often, the elders would stop him and explain that he was missing something important, a tone of voice, a gesture, or a cultural reference that changed the meaning completely. The village had its own ways of keeping track of important information. They used knotted strings to remember quantities and dates. They used carved symbols on trees to mark territory and leave messages for other villagers. They used patterns woven into cloth to record family histories. Father Francisco realized that these people already had their own forms of writing, just not the kind Europeans would recognize. As winter approached, Father Francisco faced his first major crisis. Several villagers became sick with a fever that their traditional healers couldn't cure. The The villagers knew about European diseases and how deadly they could be for indigenous people. Some began to whisper that the priest had brought bad spirits with him. Chief Tao called a meeting of the village council to discuss whether Father Francisco should be asked to leave. The meeting lasted all day, with different people arguing for and against keeping the missionary. Some pointed out that he had been helpful, sharing his knowledge and learning their language respectfully. Others argued that the timing of the illness was not a coincidence. Father Francisco was not allowed to attend this meeting, but Pira came to tell him what was happening. "They are afraid," Pira explained in his improving Portuguese. "When other Europeans came before, many people died from diseases. They think maybe you brought the sickness." That night, Father Francisco stayed awake praying and thinking. He had never considered that simply being European might make him dangerous to these people. He had brought no medicine that would cure this fever. His medical knowledge was limited to basic herbs and the idea that cleanliness helped prevent disease. The next morning, Father Francisco made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He gathered his few possessions and announced that he would leave the village until the sickness passed. If the villagers remained healthy after he left, then they would know he was not the cause of the illness. If people continued to get sick, then they would know the disease came from somewhere else. Chief Tao was impressed by this gesture. Most Europeans would have argued or demanded to stay, but Father Francisco was putting the villagers' welfare ahead of his own mission. The chief decided that the priest could stay in a small shelter about a day's walk from the village. Pira and a few other young men would bring him food and continue their reading lessons. During his month of isolation, Father Francisco used the time to work on translating Christian stories into Guarani. He had been working on this project since his arrival, but now he had time to really focus on it. The hardest part was finding ways to explain Christian concepts using ideas that made sense in Guarani culture. For example, how do you explain the concept of sin to people who think about right and wrong in completely different terms? How do you describe heaven to people whose spiritual beliefs are focused on this world and the spirits that live in forests, rivers, and mountains? Father Francisco spent hours trying different approaches, writing and rewriting the same passages. Pira visited him twice a week, bringing food and news from the village. The good news was that the fever had passed and no more people had gotten sick. The villagers were beginning to believe that Father Francisco had not been the cause of their illness. But there was also complicated news. Another missionary had arrived in the region. This new priest, Father Gomez, represented a different religious order that believed in a more aggressive approach to conversion. While Father Francisco had been learning Guarani and respecting local customs, Father Gomez believed that indigenous people should abandon their old ways completely and live exactly like European Christians. He tells people they must destroy their traditional objects, Pira reported. He says their ceremonies are evil and they must stop all old practices immediately. Many people are confused and upset. Father Francisco realized that his careful, patient approach was about to be challenged by someone who thought it was too slow and too tolerant. When he returned to the village a week later, he found the community divided and anxious. Some villagers had been impressed by Father Gomez's confident certainty. Others felt insulted by his harsh judgment of their traditions. Chief Tao called another meeting, this time with both priests present. Through translators, Father Gomez argued that the villagers needed to make a complete break with their past if they wanted to become true Christians. He promised that if they did this, they would receive protection and support from the Portuguese colonial government. Father Francisco argued for a gentler approach that would allow people to keep parts of their culture that didn't conflict with Christianity. He believed that faith should grow gradually in people's hearts, not be forced on them through fear. The debate between the two priests revealed fundamental differences in how Europeans thought about indigenous people. Father Gomez saw them as children who needed strict guidance and couldn't be trusted to make their own decisions. Father Francisco saw them as intelligent adults who deserved respect and the right to choose their own path. As the meeting continued, Father Francisco realized that more than religious conversion was at stake here. The way the villagers decided between these two approaches would determine what kind of relationship they would have with the Portuguese colonial system. Would they become a protected mission village with some autonomy, or would they be absorbed completely into the European way of life? The discussion went on for hours, with villagers asking questions and the two priests offering very different answers. Father Francisco could see that his year of patient work building trust and learning the language was now being put to the ultimate test. The village council met for 3 days to decide between the two priests. Father Francisco spent those days teaching his regular students while trying not to worry about the outcome. Pira had become quite good at reading simple Portuguese texts, and he was now helping Father Francisco teach other young people. But everyone in the village was tense and distracted. On the morning of the 4th day, Chief Tao announced the decision. The village would allow both priests to stay, but under specific conditions. Father Gomez would be responsible for teaching Christian theology and organizing religious ceremonies. Father Francisco would continue his work with reading and writing, and would also help preserve the village's traditional stories by writing them down. This solution pleased no one completely, but it allowed the village to move forward. Father Gomez was frustrated because he wanted complete control over the villagers' spiritual lives. Father Francisco was nervous about working alongside someone whose methods he disagreed with. But Chief Tao had found a practical compromise that served his people's interests. What happened over the next year surprised everyone. The two priests, forced to work together, gradually began to understand and respect each other's approaches. Father Gomez saw that Father Francisco's patient methods had created genuine affection and trust among the villagers. Father Francisco saw that Father Gomez's direct approach gave some people the clear structure they wanted. More importantly, the villagers themselves took control of their own conversion process. They listened to both priests, asked questions, and made decisions about which Christian teachings they wanted to embrace, and how those teachings would fit with their traditional beliefs. Some families became very devout Christians. Others incorporated only certain Christian practices into their existing spiritual life. Father Francisco's literacy program became the foundation for something much larger than he had originally planned. As more villagers learned to read and write, they began creating their own books. They wrote down traditional songs, stories, and recipes that had previously existed only in memory. They created written records of their laws and customs. They even began writing letters to other Guarani villages. Pira emerged as the village's first indigenous teacher. He could read and write in both Guarani and Portuguese, and he proved to be better than either priest at explaining complex ideas to his fellow villagers. Within 2 years, he was essentially running the village school, with Father Francisco serving more as an advisor than a teacher. The success of the mission attracted attention from the Portuguese colonial government. Officials in São Paulo heard about a village where indigenous people were learning European skills while maintaining their own culture. Some officials saw this as a promising model for peaceful relations with indigenous communities. Others worried that educated indigenous people might become harder to control. A government inspector arrived in 1683 to evaluate the mission. Dom Antonio de Albuquerque was a stern man who had spent years fighting indigenous resistance movements in other parts of Brazil. He expected to find either a village of completely Europeanized Christians or a group of stubborn pagans who were resisting civilization. Instead, he found something that confused him: a community that was clearly indigenous in culture and appearance, but whose people could read Portuguese documents, understood Christian teachings, and maintained friendly relations with colonial authorities. Some villagers wore European-style clothes to church on Sundays, then changed back into traditional clothing for their own ceremonies. Dom Antonio interviewed Chief Tao through an interpreter, though by this time the chief could speak basic Portuguese himself. "Are your people Christians?" the inspector asked. "Some are not yet. Some are in between," Chief Tao replied diplomatically. "We are learning about your God while still remembering our grandfather's teachings." This answer frustrated Dom Antonio, who preferred simple categories. In Satsawa, his experience, people were either loyal colonial subjects or dangerous rebels. They either accepted European culture completely or rejected it completely. The idea that people could pick and choose elements from different cultures seemed dangerous to colonial control. Father Francisco found himself in the awkward position of defending the village's approach to a government that was supposed to be supporting his mission. When Dom Antonio criticized the mission for being too tolerant of pagan practices, Father Francisco had to explain that complete cultural destruction often led to resistance and rebellion. These people are peaceful, productive, and loyal to the Portuguese crown, Father Francisco argued. They trade with colonial settlements, they provide guides and interpreters, and they've never taken up arms against us. Isn't that more valuable than forcing them to abandon everything that makes them who they are? The inspector spent 2 weeks in the village, observing daily life and interviewing residents. He was particularly interested in the literacy program and the books that villagers had written. He had never seen indigenous people create written works in their own language, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. Before leaving, Dom Antonio made a recommendation that would affect the village's future. The mission should be expanded into a proper colonial settlement. More Portuguese families should be brought in to live alongside the indigenous residents. The village should become a formal part of the colonial administration, with taxes and legal obligations like any other Portuguese settlement. This news hit the village like a thunderbolt. The people had welcomed the priests because they wanted to learn new things while keeping their autonomy. They had not agreed to become just another colonial outpost. Chief Tao called yet another council meeting to discuss this new challenge. The debate in the village was passionate and sometimes angry. Some people argued that they should abandon the mission and return to their traditional isolated life. Others said it was too late for that. Too many changes had already been made. A few villagers actually liked the idea of becoming a formal Portuguese settlement, thinking it would bring them greater security and prosperity. Father Francisco found himself in an unexpected position. He had come to convert indigenous people to Christianity, but now he was fighting to protect their right to remain culturally distinct. He wrote letters to his Jesuit superiors in São Paulo, arguing that the village should be allowed to maintain its current arrangement. But Father Francisco was fighting against powerful economic forces. The colonial government had discovered that educated, peaceful indigenous communities could be very useful. They could serve as intermediaries with hostile groups. They could provide skilled workers for colonial projects. They could help expand Portuguese control into new territories. In the end, the village made a decision that reflected their practical wisdom. They would accept formal colonial status, but on their own terms. They would elect their own local officials, continue their educational programs, and maintain their cultural practices as long as they didn't conflict with Portuguese law. Chief Tao became the village's first indigenous mayor. Pira became the official school teacher and translator. Father Francisco remained as the village priest, but he also served as an advocate for indigenous rights in the colonial government. By 1690, the former Guarani village had become the town of São Francisco do Sul, with a population of 800 people, half indigenous, half Portuguese colonists. The two communities lived side by side, sometimes uneasily, but generally peacefully. Father Francisco lived to see his mission evolve into something he had never imagined. He had come to this remote place to teach the alphabet and spread Christianity. Instead, he had helped create a new kind of community where different cultures could coexist and learn from each other. When Father Francisco died in 1705, his funeral was attended by both Guarani shamans and Portuguese officials. He was buried in the church he had helped build, but the ceremony included traditional Guarani songs alongside Christian hymns. On his gravestone, written in both Portuguese and Guarani, were the words, "He taught us to read our own stories." The town of São Francisco do Sul thrived for another century before being absorbed into the larger colonial system. But for those few decades, it stood as proof that European colonization didn't have to mean complete cultural destruction. Sometimes, with patience, respect, and a little luck, Different worlds could meet and create something new together. Maria had been running for 3 days when she finally stopped to rest. Her feet were bloody from stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness, and her cotton dress was torn from pushing through thorny bushes. Behind her, somewhere in the forest, she could still hear the dogs barking. The slave hunters were getting closer, and Maria knew that if they caught her, she would be whipped until she could barely stand, then forced back to work in the sugar fields. But Maria wasn't running aimlessly through the Brazilian wilderness. She had a destination, a place called Palmares that existed somewhere deep in the mountains of what is now the state of Alagoas. Palmares wasn't just a hiding place. It was an entire community of escaped slaves who had built their own towns, farms, and government completely hidden from the Portuguese colonial authorities. You might think it would be impossible to hide an entire town in colonial Brazil, but the country was so vast and unexplored that entire regions existed where no European had ever set foot. The Portuguese controlled the coastline and some river valleys, but the interior was a mystery filled with mountains, forests, and indigenous peoples who didn't welcome strangers. Maria had learned about Palmares from other slaves on the plantation where she worked. They whispered about it late at night in their quarters, sharing stories that might have been true, or might have been just hopeful dreams. According to these stories, Palmares was ruled by a king named Ganga Zumba, and it was home to thousands of people who lived freely, grew their own food, and answered to no Portuguese master. The stories also said that Palmares was protected by warriors who knew the forest better than any European hunter. These warriors could move through the trees without making a sound, and they could disappear into the landscape like shadows. They raided plantations to free more slaves and to capture weapons and supplies. But mostly, they just wanted to be left alone to live their own lives. Maria had made her escape during the confusion of harvest time, when all the overseers were focused on getting the sugarcane cut and processed. She had stolen some food, filled a water bottle, and slipped away from the plantation just before dawn. For the first day, she had followed a river, hoping the water would hide her scent from the tracking dogs. Now, 3 days later, she was deep in unfamiliar territory. The forest around her was thick and dark, even in the middle of the day. Huge trees created a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the ground. Vines hung down like ropes, and strange birds called to each other in languages she didn't understand. Maria had grown up on a plantation, so she had spent her entire life working in sugar fields under the hot sun. The forest was completely different from anything she knew. Everything was green and damp and alive. Insects buzzed constantly. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of water flowing over rocks. As she walked, Maria tried to remember the directions that other slaves had whispered to her. Follow the river until you reach the three-peaked mountain. Then turn toward the setting sun and walk for 2 days. Look for the carved tree with the mark of the palm leaf. Follow the hidden path from there. But Maria had never seen a three-peaked mountain, and she wasn't even sure she was still following the right river. The forest all looked the same to her, just endless trees and bushes and rocks. She was beginning to wonder if Palmares was real, or just a story that slaves told each other to make their lives more bearable. On the 4th morning, Maria woke up to find someone watching her. A young man about her own age sat quietly on a fallen log, eating what looked like roasted corn. He was dressed in simple cloth pants and a shirt that looked handmade. Most importantly, he didn't look like a slave hunter or a Portuguese soldier. "Are you looking for Palmares?" the young man asked in Portuguese, though he spoke with an accent Maria had never heard before. Maria was so surprised she could barely speak. After days of being alone in the wilderness, suddenly encountering another person felt almost like a miracle. "Yes," she whispered. "Do you know where it is?" The young man smiled. "I am from Palmares. My name is João. I was sent to watch for people like you." He studied Maria's torn clothes and bleeding feet. "You've come a long way. The hunters stopped following you yesterday. Their dogs lost your scent at the waterfall." Maria felt a wave of relief that almost made her cry. She had escaped. She was safe. and Palmares was real. "How did you know I was coming?" she asked. "We always know," João replied. "We have people watching all the trails that lead into our territory. We see everyone who enters the forest, whether they're looking for us or hunting us." João shared his breakfast with Maria, and as they ate, he explained how Palmares worked. It wasn't just one village, but a collection of settlements spread throughout the mountains. The largest was called Macaco, where King Ganga Zumba lived. But there were many smaller towns, each specializing in different things. Some focused on farming, others on making weapons or tools. Some were hidden so well that even other Palmares residents didn't know exactly where they were. "How many people live in Palmares?" Maria asked. João thought for a moment. "Maybe 20,000, maybe more. People come and go. Some stay for a few months and then try to make their way to other free territories. Others settle down, get married, have children. We even have people who were born in Palmares and have never seen a plantation." This number amazed Maria. 20,000 free people living in secret, just a few days' walk from the plantation where she had spent her entire life as a slave. It seemed impossible that the Portuguese authorities didn't know about such a large population. "But they do know about us," João explained, as if reading her thoughts. "The plantation owners and the government know that Palmares exists. They've sent armies to attack us many times, but we always escape deeper into the mountains, and they can never find all of our settlements." As they walked toward the nearest Palmares village, João told Maria more about life in the hidden kingdom. People grew corn, beans, and squash in cleared areas of the forest. They raised chickens, pigs, and goats. They made their own tools and weapons. They had their own laws and their own ways of settling disputes. Most importantly, they had their own culture that blended African traditions with Brazilian indigenous knowledge, and even some European practices. Different African ethnic groups that had been scattered by slavery were reunited in Palmares. People who had been forbidden to speak their native languages or practice their religions could do so freely. But life in Palmares wasn't easy. They were constantly under threat of attack. They had to be ready to abandon their homes and flee deeper into the forest at any moment. They had no access to European goods except what they could capture in raids. And they were always short of weapons and ammunition to defend themselves. As afternoon approached, João led Maria up a steep, winding path that seemed to appear and disappear among the trees. Just when Maria thought they were completely lost, they emerged into a cleared valley where she saw something that took her breath away. A real town with wooden houses, vegetable gardens, and people going about their daily lives, just like in any other community. The village of Subupira was smaller than Maria had imagined, but it was definitely a real town. About 40 houses lined dirt streets that had been carefully planned and laid out. Gardens grew between the houses, filled with corn, beans, sweet potatoes, and vegetables Maria didn't recognize. Children played in a central square, while women washed clothes in a stream that ran through the middle of the village. What struck Maria most was how normal everything looked. These weren't desperate people hiding in caves or living like wild animals. They were families going about their daily lives, just like on a plantation, except here they worked for themselves instead of for a master. João led Maria to a house, near the center of town where an older woman named Esperança lived. Esperança was what the people of Palmares called a mother, someone responsible for welcoming new arrivals and helping them adjust to life in the hidden kingdom. "Another daughter finds her way home," Esperança said, hugging Maria warmly. "You look tired and hungry. Come, let's get you fed and cleaned up." Inside Esperança's house, Maria saw furniture that had clearly been made by hand from local wood. The floors were swept clean, and colourful cloth hangings decorated the walls. It felt like a real home, not the bare slave quarters she was used to. As Maria ate a bowl of corn soup with beans, Esperança explained how life worked in Subupira. Everyone had a job, but they chose their own work based on their skills and interests. Some people farmed, others made tools or clothing. Some were warriors who protected the village, A few were traders who made dangerous journeys to Portuguese settlements to buy or steal necessary supplies. "What happens if someone doesn't want to work?" Maria asked. Esperanza laughed. "Everyone works here. We have to. If we don't grow food, we starve. If we don't make clothes, we go naked. If we don't defend ourselves, we die. But the difference is, we work for ourselves and our families, not to make some Portuguese man rich." After Maria had rested for a day, Esperanza took her on a tour of the village to see the different types of work people did. They visited the blacksmith shop, where men forged tools and weapons from iron they had captured in raids on plantations. They saw women weaving cloth on looms they had built themselves. They watched children learning to read and write using books that had been stolen from Portuguese settlements. The most impressive thing Maria saw was the village's defense system. Subupira looked peaceful and open, but it was actually surrounded by hidden lookout posts and defensive positions. Warriors could quickly block the main paths leading to the village, and there were secret escape routes that led deeper into the mountains. "We've been attacked 3 times, Esperanza explained. "Each time, we escaped with most of our people and supplies. The Portuguese soldiers found empty houses and cold fires. We watched them from the forest, then came back and rebuilt after they left." Maria learned that Palmares had a complex government system. Each village chose its own leaders, but they all answered to King Ganga Zumba, who lived in the main town of Macaco. The king made decisions about war and peace, trade with the outside world, and major laws that affected all the villages. But most daily decisions were made by local councils in each village. These councils included both men and women, and they discussed problems until they reached agreement. It was very different from plantation life, where one overseer made all the decisions and everyone else had to obey or face punishment. After a week in Subupira, Maria was taken to meet King Ganga, Zumba himself. The journey to Macaco took 2 days through forest paths that seemed invisible until you were actually walking on them. Guards watched them from hidden positions the entire way. Macaco was much larger than Subupira, a real city with hundreds of houses, workshops, markets, and even a palace where the king lived. The palace wasn't fancy by European standards, but it was impressive for something built entirely by escaped slaves in the middle of the wilderness. King Gangazumba was not what Maria had expected. He was a middle-aged man with grey in his hair and scars on his hands from years of manual labour. He had been born in Africa and brought to Brazil as a young man, but he had escaped during a slave rebellion and helped found Palmares. The king met with new arrivals personally, both to welcome them and to assess whether they might be spies sent by the Portuguese. He asked Maria detailed questions about the plantation she had escaped from, the route she had taken, and whether she had seen any signs of Portuguese military activity. "We must always be careful," the king explained. "The Portuguese have tried to infiltrate us many times. They send slaves who pretend to escape but are actually gathering information for future attacks." Maria answered all his questions honestly, and the king seemed satisfied that she was genuine. He assigned her to work in the royal gardens, where she would help grow food for official ceremonies and for feeding visitors from other villages. Working in the gardens, Maria met people from all over Africa and Brazil. There were people who spoke Yoruba, Bantu, Portuguese, and indigenous languages. There were people who had been slaves on sugar plantations, coffee farms, and gold mines. There were even a few who had been free but had come to Palmares seeking a better life. One of her co-workers was an old man named Kwame, who had been in Palmares for over 20 years. He told Maria stories about the early days, when the first escaped slaves had to learn everything from scratch: how to build houses, how to grow food in the forest, how to make weapons and tools. "We didn't know anything except how to work for other people," Kwame said. "We had to learn how to work for ourselves. It took years to figure out which crops would grow here, how to defend against attacks, how to make decisions together instead of having one master tell us everything." But Kwame also told darker stories about the constant threat they lived under. Portuguese expeditions came every few years, sometimes bringing hundreds of soldiers. They burned villages, captured people to sell back into slavery, and destroyed. Crops and animals. We always rebuild, Kwame said. That's what we do. They knock us down, we get back up. They think they can destroy us, but we're like water. We flow around obstacles and find new paths. Maria had been in Palmares for 3 months when the next attack came. She was working in the gardens when she heard the warning drums that meant Portuguese soldiers had been spotted approaching the mountains. Within minutes, the entire city was in motion. People grabbed what they could carry and headed for predetermined escape routes. Families had practiced this so many times that even small children knew exactly what to do. Some warriors stayed behind to slow down the attackers, while others herded community members towards safety in deeper parts of the forest. Maria found herself running through the woods again, but this time she wasn't alone. She was part of a community, helping to carry supplies and guide frightened newcomers who had never experienced a Portuguese attack before. For 2 weeks, they lived in temporary camps hidden in remote valleys. Scouts brought reports about what the soldiers were doing to their abandoned villages. As usual, the Portuguese found mostly empty buildings. They destroyed what they could, but they couldn't destroy the people or the idea of freedom that had created Palmares. When the soldiers finally gave up and returned to the coast, the people of Palmares began the familiar process of going back and rebuilding. Maria helped replant the royal gardens and repair houses that had been damaged. She marveled at how quickly the community could bounce back from such a devastating attack. The attack had scattered the people of Palmares, but it had also revealed something important to Maria. This wasn't just a place where escaped slaves hid from their former masters. This was a nation with its own identity, its own culture, and its own determination to survive no matter what. During the rebuilding, Maria met Domingo, a warrior who had fought in the battle to delay the Portuguese soldiers. He had been born in Palmares, the son of escaped slaves, and had never known life on a plantation. To him, the forest was home, the hidden villages were normal, and the constant threat of attack was just part of life. My parents tell me stories about plantation life, Domingo said as they worked together to rebuild a burned house. It sounds like a nightmare to me, getting up when someone else tells you to get up, working only to make another person rich, being bought and sold like cattle. Maria tried to explain what plantation life was really like, but she realized that to someone born free, the idea of slavery was as foreign as the idea of freedom had once been to her. Domingo had grown up thinking it was normal to make decisions for yourself, to keep what you produced, to love who you wanted to love. As weeks passed, Maria began to understand that Palmares was more than just a refuge for escaped slaves. It was an experiment in creating a different kind of society. People from dozens of different African cultures had come together and blended their traditions into something new. They had combined what they remembered from Africa with things they had learned from indigenous Brazilians and even some ideas they had picked up from European culture. For example, the government of Palmares mixed African concepts of kingship with Portuguese ideas about law and indigenous practices of decision-making by council. The religion combined African spirits with Catholic saints and indigenous nature worship. Even the food was a fusion. African crops like okra and yams grew alongside indigenous corn and beans, prepared with cooking techniques from all three cultures. Maria began to feel truly settled in Palmares when she fell in love with Domingo. Their courtship was conducted according to Palmares traditions, which required approval from both families and a ceremony that combined elements from different cultural backgrounds. The wedding celebration lasted 3 days and included music, dancing, and food from across Africa and Brazil. Now Maria had a stake in Palmares' survival beyond just her own freedom. She and Domingo were planning to start a family, and the idea of raising children in this hidden kingdom made the community's struggles feel more personal and urgent. But the Portuguese were not giving up. In 1680, King Ganga Zumba made a decision that split Palmares down the middle. Faced with increasingly aggressive military campaigns, he decided to negotiate with the Portuguese authorities. He proposed that Palmares be recognized as a legitimate state, with the Portuguese acknowledging the freedom of all people born in Palmares while returning recently escaped slaves to their masters. The proposed treaty created enormous controversy. within Palmares. Some people, especially the older residents who were tired of constantly running from attacks, supported the king's attempt at negotiation. They argued that formal recognition might bring peace and allow the community to grow and prosper openly, but many others, particularly the warriors and recently escaped slaves, saw the treaty as a betrayal. They pointed out that agreeing to return new runaways would mean abandoning the very people who needed Palmares most. It would also mean accepting Portuguese authority over their lives. Maria found herself torn between these positions. Part of her wanted the peace and security that recognition might bring. She was tired of always being ready to run, tired of living in fear of the next attack, but she also remembered what it felt like to be a slave, and she couldn't bear the thought of turning away other people who were seeking the freedom she had found. The conflict came to a head when a group of warriors, led by a man named Zumbi, who was either the king's nephew or his son, the records are unclear, rejected the treaty entirely. They declared that they would continue fighting for complete independence, with no compromises with the Portuguese. King Ganga Zumba was assassinated in 1681, probably by opponents of the treaty. Zumbi became the new king of Palmares, and any hope of a peaceful settlement disappeared. The Portuguese resumed their military campaigns, but now they were more determined than ever to completely destroy the rebel kingdom. Under King Zumbi's leadership, Palmares became more militarized. Every adult learned to fight, and new defense strategies were developed. Villages were designed to be abandoned quickly, with important supplies hidden in secret caches throughout the forest. The kingdom's economy was reorganized to support constant warfare. Maria and Domingo had 2 children during these difficult years, a daughter named Clara and a son named Paulo. Growing up in wartime Palmares was very different from Maria's own childhood on a plantation, but it was also different from the relatively peaceful Palmares that existed when she first arrived. The children learned to read and write, but they also learned to move silently through the forest and to recognize the sounds that meant danger was approaching. They played games that were actually training for escape and survival. They grew up proud of their heritage, but always aware that their freedom could be taken away at any moment. In 1694, the Portuguese launched their most serious attack yet. Governor Domingos Jorge Velho brought an army of over 9,000 men, including Portuguese soldiers, indigenous warriors, and armed colonists. This time, the Portuguese had decided to hunt down every single settlement in Palmares and kill or capture every resident. The final battle lasted for months. King Zumbi led a desperate defense, but the Portuguese had overwhelming numbers and better weapons. One by one, the hidden villages were discovered and destroyed. Thousands of people were killed or captured. The survivors scattered into the deepest parts of the forest. Maria, Domingo, and their children escaped the final destruction of Palmares, but they were part of a much smaller group of refugees. The great kingdom that had sheltered thousands was broken, its people scattered to the winds. King Zumbi himself was captured and killed in 1695, his head displayed in the town square of Recife as proof that the rebellion was finally over. But the Portuguese victory wasn't as complete as they claimed. Many survivors of Palmares founded smaller communities throughout Brazil. The idea of freedom that Palmares represented couldn't be killed with weapons. Escapes from plantations continued, and new refugees were established in remote areas. Maria lived to be an old woman, telling her grandchildren stories about the time when thousands of free people built a nation in the forest. She died in 1718, in a small farming community in the interior of Minas Gerais, surrounded by descendants who had been born free because of the courage of people like her. Today, the ruins of some Palmares settlements can still be found in the mountains of Alagoas. But the real legacy of Palmares isn't in the archaeological remains. It's in the memory of nearly a century when people who had been told they were property proved that they could govern themselves, build communities, and fight for their freedom. Palmares showed that resistance to slavery could be more than just individual acts of rebellion. It could be organized, sustained, and successful for generations. The kingdom lasted longer than many European colonies and created a unique culture that blended influences from across the Atlantic world. Most importantly, Palmares proved something that slave owners desperately wanted to deny: that enslaved people were fully human beings capable of creating their own societies, laws, and culture when given the chance. For nearly 100 years, in the mountains of Brazil, that truth was lived out daily by thousands of people who refused to accept that their freedom was something that others could take away. Captain Manuel Santos had been sailing between Lisbon and Brazil for 15 years, but he still felt nervous every time he saw the Portuguese coast disappear behind him. It was March 1685, and his ship, the Santa Esperança, was loaded with everything a colonial settlement might need: barrels of olive oil, cases of wine, bolts of European cloth, iron tools, religious books, and even a few pieces of furniture, wrapped in canvas to protect them from the salt air. The Santa Esperança wasn't a big ship by the standards of the day, just 90 feet long and carrying about 200 tons of cargo, but it was Captain Santos's entire world. He had bought a share of the ship after years of working for other captains, and now his family's future depended on making successful voyages across one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world. You might think that by 1685, sailing to Brazil was routine and safe. After all, Portuguese ships had been making this journey for almost 200 years. But every voyage was still a risk. Ships could be sunk by storms, captured by pirates, or simply disappear without a trace. The ocean between Europe and South America was vast, unpredictable, and full of dangers that could kill everyone on board. Captain Santos's crew consisted of 22 men, each with specific skills needed to keep the ship sailing. There was Drone the navigator, who could read the stars and use primitive instruments to figure out where they were. There was Pedro the carpenter, who could repair damage to the wooden hull during the voyage. There was Antonio the cook, who somehow managed to prepare edible meals using supplies that had been sitting in barrels for weeks. The crew also included several apprentice sailors, young men learning the trade by doing the hardest and most dangerous jobs on the ship. They climbed the rigging to adjust sails in all kinds of weather, worked the pumps that kept water out of the bottom of the ship, and took turns on watch duty through the long nights at sea. But the Santa Esperança wasn't just carrying cargo and crew. This voyage also included 12 passengers, Portuguese families moving to Brazil to start new lives in the colonies. There were 2 couples with children, a single man hoping to open a shop in Salvador, and a widow joining her brother who had been living in Brazil for 10 years. These passengers paid for their passage by giving Captain Santos a share of any profits they made in Brazil. It was a risky arrangement for everyone involved. If the passengers prospered, the captain would do well. If they failed or died, he would lose his investment. But this kind of partnership was common because very few people could afford to pay cash for passage to Brazil. The passengers lived in a cramped space below deck that was barely big enough for their hammocks and personal belongings. They had to bring their own food for the journey, which typically lasted 2 to 3 months. Women and children especially suffered during these voyages, since they had almost no privacy and very little room to move around. Captain Santos tried to be fair and considerate with his passengers, but he also had to maintain discipline on the ship. The ocean didn't care about people's feelings or comfort. When storms came, everyone had to follow orders quickly and without question, or the ship could sink. 3 days out of Lisbon, they encountered their first serious problem. The wind died completely, leaving them floating on calm seas under a hot sun. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Without wind, they couldn't make progress toward Brazil, and they were using up their supplies of food and fresh water. During these calm periods, called doldrums, everyone on board had to be very careful with water. Each person was limited to a fixed amount per day, barely enough for drinking. There was no water for washing clothes or bodies. People quickly began to smell, and the close quarters made the situation even more unpleasant. Captain Santos used the time to check and repair equipment. Sails were mended, ropes were replaced, and the ship's hull was examined for any damage. The passengers helped with simple tasks like preparing dried fish or mending their own clothes. Everyone tried to stay busy to avoid thinking about how slowly their supplies were dwindling. After 6 days, a light breeze finally returned, and they continued south along the African coast. This route was longer than sailing directly west, but it allowed ships to pick up favorable winds and currents that would push them toward Brazil. It also provided opportunities to stop for fresh water and supplies at Portuguese trading posts along the African coast. But following the African coast also meant passing through waters where pirates operated. These weren't the romantic pirates of adventure stories. They were desperate men who would kill everyone on a merchant ship to steal cargo that might be worth more than they could earn in years of honest work. Captain Santos carried 2 small cannons and a dozen muskets to defend against pirate attacks. But he knew that if they encountered a well-armed pirate ship, their only hope was to outrun it. The Santa Esperança was built for cargo capacity, not speed, which made running away a difficult option. 2 weeks into the voyage, they spotted another ship following them. At first, Captain Santos hoped it might be another Portuguese merchant vessel traveling the same route, but as the ship got closer, he could see that it was flying no flag and appeared to be trying to catch up with them. "All hands on deck," Captain Santos shouted. "Prepare to make sail." The next few hours were a race between the 2 ships. Captain Santos ordered every possible sail to be raised, trying to squeeze every bit of speed from the Santa Esperança. The crew worked frantically to adjust the rigging for maximum efficiency. Even the passengers helped by hauling on ropes and doing whatever they were told. Slowly, the mysterious ship began gaining on them. Through his telescope, Captain Santos could see armed men on the other vessel's deck. There was no doubt now. They were being chased by pirates. Captain Santos faced a terrible decision. Should he try to fight and risk everyone's lives? Should he surrender and hope the pirates would spare the passengers? Or should he try one last desperate maneuver to escape? He chose to head for a group of small islands where he hoped the Santa Esperança's smaller size might give them an advantage in shallow water. It was incredibly risky. If they ran aground, they would be completely helpless. But if they could reach the islands and hide among them, they might lose their pursuers. As the sun began to set, painting the ocean red and gold, Captain Santos steered his ship into the treacherous waters around the islands. Behind them, the pirate ship was close enough that they could hear shouting from its deck. The chase through the islands lasted until well after dark. Captain Santos used his knowledge of these waters to navigate between rocky outcrops and coral reefs that could tear the bottom out of a ship. The pirate vessel, unfamiliar with the area, had to slow down and eventually gave up the pursuit rather than risk running aground in the darkness. When dawn broke, the Santa Esperança was alone on calm seas. Captain Santos had successfully outmaneuvered the pirates, but the escape had cost them precious time and had taken them off course. Now they had to backtrack to pick up the trade winds that would carry them across the Atlantic. The passengers were shaken by their close call with pirates, but Captain Santos used the experience to explain the realities of ocean travel. "The sea is not our enemy," he told them during their morning prayers on deck. "But it is not our friend either. It simply is. We must respect it, prepare for its dangers, and trust in God to see us safely to our destination." As they sailed west, into the open ocean, life on the ship settled into a routine. The crew worked in shifts, with some men always on duty to handle the sails and watch for problems. The passengers found ways to pass the time. The children played simple games. The women sewed and mended clothes, and the men discussed their plans for life in Brazil. Captain Santos spent hours each day working on navigation. Using an astrolabe and compass, he tried to figure out exactly where they were on the vast ocean. This was much harder than it sounds. There were no landmarks to guide them, and small errors in calculation could lead them hundreds of miles off course. The ship's position was calculated by dead reckoning, estimating speed and direction traveled each day and keeping a running total. But ocean currents could push them off course, and it was easy to misjudge their speed. Many ships had sailed past Brazil entirely and ended up lost in the South Atlantic. Food became a constant concern as the weeks passed. The ship carried salted pork, dried fish, hardtack biscuits, beans, and rice, foods that would last for months without spoiling. But eating the same things day after day made everyone tired and weak. Fresh food was just a memory. By the 6th week of the voyage, some passengers were showing signs of scurvy, a disease caused by lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. Their gums became swollen and bloody, their skin developed dark spots, and they felt constantly exhausted. Captain Santos had seen this disease many times before and knew it could kill people if the voyage lasted too long. Water was an even bigger problem than food. The ship carried water in large wooden barrels, but the water gradually became stale and full of floating particles. Everyone had to strain their daily water ration through cloth to remove the worst of the algae and debris. Some people got sick from drinking bad water, which made the voyage even more miserable. The passengers suffered more than the crew, who were used to the hardships of sea travel. One passenger, a merchant named Rodriguez, became so sick that he couldn't leave his hammock for days at a time. His wife nursed him as best she could, but without fresh food or medicine, there was little she could do. Captain Santos tried to keep morale up by telling stories of Brazil and the opportunities waiting there. He described cities like Salvador and Rio de Janeiro, with their churches, markets, and growing populations. He talked about the rich farmland where crops grew year-round, and the gold discoveries that were making some colonists wealthy. But privately, Captain Santos was worried. They had been at sea for 2 months and had not yet spotted the Brazilian coast. His calculations suggested they should be getting close, but navigation was as much art as science, and he could easily be wrong. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when the lookout spotted birds flying in formation. Certain types of birds meant that land was nearby, usually within a day or two of sailing. Captain Santos adjusted their course to follow the birds' flight path, and the next day they saw the green hills of Brazil rising from the ocean. The passengers crowded on deck to get their first glimpse of their new home. After 2 months of seeing nothing but water and sky, the sight of land brought tears to many eyes. Children who had been born in Portugal asked their parents what those green things were. They had never seen trees before. But reaching the Brazilian coast was only the beginning of their challenges. Captain Santos had to find the entrance to Salvador's harbour, which was protected by forts and surrounded by dangerous rocks. Ships had to approach at exactly the right angle and time their arrival with the tides. As they sailed along the coast, looking for the harbour entrance, they encountered other ships, both Portuguese vessels and foreign traders who were not supposed to be in Brazilian waters. The Portuguese tried to keep tight control over who could trade with their colony, but merchants from other European countries often ignored these restrictions. Captain Santos fired a signal cannon to announce their arrival to the port authorities in Salvador. In response, a small boat came out from shore carrying a harbour pilot, a man who specialized in guiding ships safely into port. The pilot climbed aboard the Santa Esperança and took over navigation for the final approach. The entrance to Salvador's harbour was narrow and tricky, with strong currents and hidden rocks that could sink a ship. But the pilot knew every detail of these waters. He guided them past the forts that guarded the harbour, where soldiers watched to make sure no enemy ships tried to enter. As they sailed into the protected waters of the harbour, Captain Santos and his passengers got their first good look at Salvador, Brazil's colonial capital. The city was built on high cliffs overlooking the bay, with white buildings and red tile roofs spread across several hills. Ships of all sizes filled the harbour, merchant vessels, fishing boats, and even some warships. The Santa Esperança anchored, among dozens of other ships waiting to unload their cargo. Salvador was one of the busiest ports in the Portuguese Empire, handling trade not just with Portugal, but with other parts of Brazil, with Africa, and sometimes illegally with other European colonies. Before anyone could leave the ship, officials came aboard to inspect the cargo and passengers. They checked Captain Santos's papers, counted the passengers, and made sure all required taxes would be paid. This process could take days, during which everyone had to remain on the ship despite being within sight of land. The inspection revealed that some of the cargo had been damaged during the voyage. Several barrels of olive oil had leaked, and some books had been ruined by moisture. This was always a risk on ocean voyages, and Captain Santos would have to absorb these losses. But most of the cargo had survived in good condition and would command good prices in the colonial markets. Finally, after 2.5 months at sea, the passengers were allowed to disembark. They climbed down into small boats that ferried them to the shore, carrying their possessions and their hopes for a new life in Brazil. The process of unloading the Santa Esperança took almost 2 weeks. Everything had to be carefully catalogued, inspected, and taxed before it could be sold. Captain Santos spent long days in stuffy government offices, arguing with officials about the value of his cargo and the taxes he owed to the Portuguese crown. Salvador in 1685 was a city of contrasts that shocked many newcomers. The wealthy part of the city, built on the high cliffs, featured beautiful churches, government buildings, and mansions where Portuguese officials and successful merchants lived. But down by the harbour, in the lower city, the streets were crowded with workers, sailors, slaves, and all the noisy, smelly business of a busy port. Captain Santos had to arrange for warehouses to store his cargo while he found buyers. He also had to hire local workers to move everything from the ship to the warehouses. Most of these workers were African slaves, though there were also free people of mixed race who made their living loading and unloading ships. The passengers from his ship scattered throughout the city to begin their new lives. The merchant Rodriguez, who had been so sick during the voyage, recovered quickly once he could eat fresh food and sleep in a real bed. He rented a small shop near the harbour and began selling some of the European goods he had brought with him. Families with children found lodging in boarding houses while they looked for permanent homes. The children were amazed by everything they saw. Tropical fruits they had never tasted, birds with bright-coloured feathers, and people speaking different languages. For them, Brazil was like stepping into an entirely different world. Captain Santos spent his evenings in taverns near the harbour, talking with other ship captains and merchants. These conversations weren't just social, they were how he gathered information about market conditions, weather patterns, and opportunities for future voyages. From these talks, Captain Santos learned that sugar prices in Europe were high, making it a good time to carry Brazilian sugar back to Lisbon. He also heard about new gold discoveries in the interior, which were bringing prospectors to Brazil and creating demand for European tools and supplies. But the conversations also revealed new dangers. Pirates were becoming more active in Brazilian waters, and several ships had been captured in recent months. There were also rumours that Britain and France were planning to attack Portuguese colonies as part of their ongoing wars in Europe. Captain Santos decided to load his ship with Brazilian products for the return voyage to Portugal. Sugar was the most valuable cargo, but he also bought tobacco, cotton, hardwoods, and some exotic bird feathers that were fashionable in European hats. He even purchased a small amount of gold dust from miners who had come down from the interior. Loading cargo for the return trip was different from unloading. Everything had to be packed carefully to prevent damage during the ocean crossing. Sugar needed to be protected from moisture. Tobacco had to be kept dry. The bird feathers required special containers to prevent them from being crushed. Captain Santos also had to find passengers for the return voyage. Some were Portuguese officials whose terms of service in Brazil had ended. Others were colonists who had made their fortunes and wanted to return to Portugal to enjoy their wealth. A few were missionaries going back to Europe to report on their work in Brazil. The return passengers were generally more comfortable than those coming to Brazil. They knew what to expect from ocean travel, and they usually had more money to spend on better accommodations and food supplies. But they also faced the sadness of leaving behind family members and friends who were staying in Brazil. Before departing Salvador, Captain Santos had to deal with one final challenge: crew members who wanted to abandon ship and try their luck in Brazil. This was a constant problem for ship captains. Young sailors would see the opportunities in the colonies and decide to jump ship rather than return to the hard life of ocean sailing. 2 of Captain Santos's crew members had disappeared into the city, probably intending to find work on sugar. plantations or in the growing mining regions. He had to recruit replacements from among the sailors stranded in Salvador, men whose own ships had sailed without them or who had been dismissed for various reasons. The new crew members were a mixed group. One was an experienced sailor from Spain who had been working on Portuguese ships illegally. Another was a young Portuguese man who had come to Brazil seeking his fortune but had failed and now wanted to return home. A third was a former slave who had somehow earned his freedom and learned seamanship. After 6 weeks in Salvador, the Santa Esperança was ready for its return voyage. The ship was loaded with Brazilian products worth much more than the European goods Captain Santos had brought to Brazil. If he could get this cargo safely to Lisbon, he would make a substantial profit. The departure from Salvador was less dramatic than their arrival. By now, Captain Santos's passengers were used to life on shipboard, and the crew had worked together long enough to know their jobs. The ship sailed out of the harbour on a clear morning, past the forts and into the open ocean. The return voyage followed a different route than the westward journey. Instead of following the African coast, they sailed northeast toward the Azores Islands, where they could stop for fresh supplies before the final leg to Lisbon. This route was shorter, but more dangerous because it took them through waters where European warships and pirates both operated. 3 weeks into the return voyage, they encountered a convoy of Portuguese warships escorting merchant vessels back to Europe. Captain Santos was invited to join the convoy for protection, which he gladly accepted. Sailing in a group was slower, but it was much safer than traveling alone. The convoy system revealed how dangerous ocean trade had become. The ships traveled in formation, with warships on all sides watching for enemy vessels. Each merchant ship had to stay in its assigned position and follow the convoy's schedule exactly. Anyone who fell behind or broke formation risked being left to face pirates or enemy warships alone. During the convoy voyage, Captain Santos met other ship captains and learned about changes happening in the Atlantic trade. New shipping routes were opening up as European colonies expanded. Competition between European powers was increasing, making trade both more profitable and more dangerous. The most interesting passenger on the return voyage was Father Antonio, a Jesuit priest who had spent 20 years establishing missions in the Brazilian interior. He told Captain Santos stories about indigenous peoples, about the challenges of traveling through unexplored territory, and about the complex relationships between different groups in colonial Brazil. Father Antonio also carried with him detailed maps of river systems in the interior, drawings of plants and animals found nowhere else in the world, and manuscripts in indigenous languages that he had learned during his missions. His work was part of a larger effort by the Portuguese to understand and control the vast territories they claimed in South America. When the Santa Esperança finally reached Lisbon in November 1685, Captain Santos had completed one of thousands of similar voyages that connected Europe and Brazil. The cargo he carried would end up in markets, shops, and homes throughout Portugal and other parts of Europe. The passengers he transported would influence colonial policies and economic decisions. But Captain Santos understood something that many people in Lisbon didn't fully appreciate. Brazil was no longer just a Portuguese colony that produced raw materials for European use. It was becoming a complex society with its own economy, culture, and interests. The ships that connected Europe and Brazil weren't just carrying goods and people. They were carrying ideas, news, and influences that moved in both directions. Over his 15 years of sailing between Portugal and Brazil, Captain Santos had watched the relationship between the two places evolve. Brazil was growing more independent and self-sufficient. Portuguese colonists were becoming Brazilians, with loyalties and interests that sometimes conflicted with Portuguese policies. Captain Santos himself had changed during these years. He had started as a simple sailor following orders, but had become a small businessman with investments on both sides of the Atlantic. He owned shares in Brazilian plantations, had family connections in colonial cities, and understood colonial markets as well as European ones. As he walked through the familiar streets of Lisbon after months at sea, Captain Santos was already planning his next voyage to Brazil. The ocean that separated Europe and South America was dangerous and unpredictable, but it was also the highway that carried the wealth, people, and ideas that were reshaping both continents. Every voyage was a gamble with nature, pirates, disease, and the uncertain economics of colonial trade. But for men like Captain Santos, it was also an opportunity to be part of something larger than themselves, the creation of connections that would eventually bind together the Portuguese Empire and lay the foundation for the modern Atlantic world. Joaquim Barbosa had been walking behind cattle for so long that he could identify individual cows by the sound of their footsteps. It was 1720, and he was leading a herd of 800 head from the interior grasslands of Bahia to the coastal city of Salvador, a journey that would take almost 3 months through territory that had no roads, no maps, and very few people. Joaquim wasn't just any cattle herder. He was what Brazilians called a vaqueiro, a special kind of cowboy who could navigate the wilderness between Brazil's cattle ranches and its cities. The vaqueiros were the invisible threads that connected the isolated interior of the country to its populated coast, bringing the beef that fed colonial cities and the hides that supplied Brazil's first major industry. You might wonder why anyone would walk cattle for hundreds of miles when it would be easier to raise them closer to where people lived. But in colonial Brazil, the best grazing land was far from the coast, in a hot, dry region called the Sertão. The coastal areas were already taken up by sugar plantations, and the Sertão had grass and water that could support huge herds of cattle. Joaquim's herd belonged to Colonel Manuel da Costa, who owned a ranch covering thousands of acres in the interior. But Colonel Costa had never actually seen most of his land. He lived in a mansion in Salvador and depended on vaqueiros like Joaquim to manage his cattle and bring them to market when they were ready to sell. The cattle they herded weren't like modern cows. These were small, tough animals descended from Portuguese breeds adapted to Brazil's heat and drought. They could survive on scrubby grass and go for days without water. Most importantly, they could walk for months without losing too much weight. Joaquim traveled with a crew of 6 other vaqueiros, each with specific skills needed for the long journey. There was Manuel, who was the best at finding water in the dry landscape. There was Pedro, who could treat sick or injured cattle using traditional remedies. There was young Antonio, who had sharp eyes for spotting strays or predators. The vaqueiros dressed in heavy leather clothes that protected them from thorny bushes, cattle horns, and the blazing sun. They wore leather hats, leather vests, leather pants, and leather boots. In the hot climate, this clothing was uncomfortable, but it was essential protection in the rough wilderness. Each man carried very little personal equipment: a hammock for sleeping, a water bottle, some dried meat and farinha, cassava flour, and basic tools for cattle herding. They also carried muskets for protection against jaguars, wild boars, and occasionally hostile indigenous people or bandits. The route from the interior to Salvador wasn't marked by any roads or signs. Instead, Joaquim followed cattle trails that had been worn into the landscape over decades of use. These trails connected water sources, grazing areas, and river crossings. Knowing these trails was like knowing a secret map of the Brazilian interior. At night, the cattle were gathered into a loose group, and the vaqueiros took turns standing watch. Cattle could scatter if they were frightened by wild animals or sudden noises. One stampede could lose dozens of animals and add weeks to the journey. The men slept in hammocks, strung between trees when possible, or on the ground when they were crossing open areas. Finding water was the most critical challenge of every day. Cattle needed to drink regularly, and the vaqueiros needed water for cooking and drinking. Joaquim knew the location of every reliable water source along the route, but drought could dry up springs and streams, forcing dangerous detours. Food for the men came mostly from hunting and from supplies they carried. They ate small game like armadillos and birds, fish from rivers they crossed, and occasionally wild fruits. When they got desperate, they would slaughter one of the cattle, but this reduced the herd's value and was avoided if possible. The journey tested both men and animals constantly. Cattle got sick from eating poisonous plants, injured themselves on rocks or tree branches, or simply became too exhausted to continue. The vaqueros had to make quick decisions about whether to treat an animal, abandon it, or put it out of its misery. River crossings were especially dangerous. Some rivers were shallow enough to wade across, but others required swimming. Cattle were good swimmers, but they could panic in fast-moving water. The vaqueros had to guide the herd carefully, making sure the animals didn't turn back or scatter during the crossing. About a month into the journey, while crossing a swollen river, Joaquim's crew lost 23 head of cattle. The animals panicked when one cow was swept downstream by the current, and several others followed. The vaqueros managed to save most of the herd, but the lost animals represented a significant financial loss. They also faced human dangers along the route. The Brazilian interior was home to indigenous groups who sometimes saw the cattle herds as threats to their territory or as opportunities for raids. Some were friendly and would trade with the vaqueros, but others were hostile. More frequently, they encountered other travelers, traders carrying goods between cities, prospectors heading to gold mining regions, or runaway slaves trying to reach free territories. These meetings could be friendly exchanges of information and supplies, or tense confrontations where each group worried that the other might be bandits. About halfway through their journey, Joaquim's crew met another group of vaqueros heading in the opposite direction, back toward the interior after delivering their own herd. These meetings were important opportunities to exchange news, get updates on trail conditions, and share information about water sources. The drought has dried up the spring at Pozo Seco, the other leader warned Joaquim. You'll have to go 20 miles south to the San Francisco River to water your herd. And watch out for jaguars near the river. We lost 2 cattle to a big cat there. This kind of information was invaluable, but it also meant constantly adjusting the route based on changing conditions. Joaquim carried a rough map in his head of dozens of alternative trails, water sources, and river crossings that he could use depending on circumstances. The cattle themselves seemed to understand the routine of the journey. Each morning, they would automatically form into a loose column and begin walking. The lead animals followed Joaquim, while the other vaqueros rode alongside the herd to keep stragglers from falling behind. As they got closer to the coast, the landscape began to change. The dry grasslands gave way to more humid forest areas. The cattle had to be watched more carefully because the vegetation was different, and some plants that were safe in the interior could make animals sick in the coastal regions. During the last month of the journey, Joaquim began to worry about something that had nothing to do with cattle. What would happen when they reached Salvador? The city had been growing rapidly, and there were rumors that the government was planning new taxes on cattle brought from the interior. As Joaquim's herd approached the coastal region, the challenges changed from finding water and avoiding predators to dealing with people. The closer they got to Salvador, the more frequently they encountered other travelers, small settlements, and most importantly, government officials who wanted to count and tax everything that passed through their territory. 3 weeks before, reaching Salvador, they came to the town of Feira de Santana, which had grown up around cattle trade. This wasn't much of a town by European standards, just a collection of wooden buildings, a small church, and some basic shops. But for vaqueros, who had been in the wilderness for months, it felt like a big city. In Feira de Santana, Joaquim had to register his herd with local officials and pay a transport tax before continuing to Salvador. The tax collector was a thin Portuguese man who had clearly never spent a day herding cattle, but who insisted on personally counting every animal in the herd. 767 head, the tax collector announced after spending half a day examining the cattle. That will be 12 milreis in taxes, plus 2 milreis for the counting fee. Joaquim paid the taxes from a leather pouch where he kept Colonel Costa's money, but he protested the counting fee. "We've been paying transport taxes for 20 years, he said. "There's never been a counting fee before." The tax collector shrugged. "There is now. New orders from Salvador. The government needs more revenue for defense." This was Joaquim's introduction to how colonial Brazil was changing. The government was becoming more organized and more determined to collect taxes on everything. For vaqueros, this meant more delays, more paperwork, and higher costs that eventually came out of their employers' profits and their own wages. In Feira de Santana, Joaquim also got his first information about market conditions in Salvador. A local cattle dealer told him that prices were good because several ships were in port, loading beef for European markets. But he also warned that the city was trying to control where cattle could be slaughtered and sold. They're building new slaughterhouses outside the city, the dealer explained. They say the old ways are unsanitary and bad for business. You can't just drive your herd to market anymore. You have to use the official facilities and pay their fees. This news worried Joaquim. For decades, cattle herders had brought their animals directly to buyers in Salvador, who would slaughter them in yards throughout the city. This direct trade kept costs low and allowed vaqueros to negotiate the best prices for their employers. After resting for 2 days in Feira de Santana, the herd continued towards Salvador. The landscape was now green and humid, very different from the dry interior. The cattle, accustomed to sparse grass and little water, had to be watched carefully to prevent them from overeating on the rich coastal vegetation. They also encountered much more traffic on the roads near Salvador. Ox carts carried sugar and tobacco to port. Mule trains brought manufactured goods from the city to interior settlements. Groups of slaves walked under guard to work sites. And everywhere there were people, more people than Joaquim had seen for months. The final approach to Salvador required crossing the Paraguaçu River on a ferry operated by the colonial government. Getting 800 cattle across the river was a complex operation that took an entire day. The animals had to be loaded onto large wooden rafts in groups of about 50, while the vaqueros swam their horses alongside. The ferry operators charged by the animal, and they insisted on counting each cow as it boarded. This gave them multiple opportunities to demand extra fees for difficult animals or special handling. By the time the entire herd was across the river, Joaquim had paid almost as much in ferry fees as he had in transport taxes. On the outskirts of Salvador, Joaquim faced his first experience with the new cattle regulations. Officials directed him to a large fenced area where his herd would be held for inspection before being allowed into the city. The inspection included checking for diseases, verifying ownership documents, and of course, collecting more fees. Dr. Silveira, the government veterinarian, walked through the herd examining animals for signs of disease. Most colonial officials knew nothing about cattle, but Dr. Silveira had actually studied in Europe and understood animal health better than many vaqueros. "Your animals are in good condition," Dr. Silveira told Joaquim, "but I need to quarantine 12 head that show signs of skin problems. They can't enter the city until they're treated." Quarantine meant more delays and more expenses. Joaquim would have to pay for feeding the quarantined animals, for the treatment Dr. Silveira provided, and for guards to watch them. What had once been a simple matter of driving cattle to market was becoming an expensive bureaucratic process. While dealing with the quarantine, Joaquim sent word to Colonel Costa's representative in Salvador that the herd had arrived. Colonel Costa, like many ranch owners, maintained an agent in the city whose job was to arrange sales and handle the business side of cattle trading. The representative, a mulatto man named Jose, who had been born in Salvador, came to inspect the herd and negotiate with potential buyers. Jose understood both the vaquero system and the changing urban market in ways that neither Joaquim nor Colonel Costa fully grasped. "The city is growing fast," Jose explained to Joaquim. "More people means more demand for beef, but also more rules about how business is conducted. The old ways of doing things don't work anymore." Jose had already arranged for a Portuguese merchant to buy half the herd for export to Europe. The other half would be sold to local butchers who supplied Salvador's taverns, restaurants, and wealthy households. But all the cattle had to be processed through the new municipal slaughterhouses. The slaughterhouses were located outside the city walls in an area that had been farmland just a few years earlier. They were designed according to European standards, with proper drainage, separation areas for different types of animals, and facilities for processing hides as well as meat. Joaquim was amazed by these modern facilities, but he was also troubled. by what they represented. The slaughterhouses were expensive to operate and charged high fees for their services. These costs would eventually reduce profits for ranch owners like Colonel Costa, which would mean lower payments for vaqueros. More importantly, the new system reduced the independence that vaqueros like Joaquim had always valued. Instead of dealing directly with buyers and negotiating their own deals, they now had to work within a regulated system controlled by city officials who had never been in the Sertão. But Joaquim also saw opportunities in the changing system. The new market was much larger than the old one. Ships regularly carried Brazilian beef to Europe, where it commanded high prices. The growing cities of Brazil's coast needed steady supplies of meat that only the interior ranches could provide. As he watched his cattle being processed in the modern slaughterhouses, Joaquim realized that his profession was evolving. The days of vaqueros operating as independent cowboys in an empty wilderness were ending. Brazil was becoming more organized, more urban, and more connected to world markets. But there would still be a place for men who understood cattle, who could navigate the trackless interior, and who could manage the complex logistics of moving herds across hundreds of miles. The vaqueros would have to adapt to new rules and new markets, but their skills were still essential. 3 weeks after arriving in Salvador, Joaquim had sold the entire herd, settled all accounts, and was preparing for the journey back to Colonel Costa's ranch. He would travel light this time, carrying payment for the cattle and orders for the next herd to be driven to market. The return journey would take only 6 weeks, since he wouldn't be slowed down by 800 cows. But it would give him time to think about the changes he had witnessed and how they might affect his future as a vaquero. The journey back to the Sertão was vastly different from the 3-month cattle drive. Joaquim and his crew traveled on horseback, covering in one-day distances that had taken a week with the herd. They carried letters, money, and small manufactured goods that Colonel Costa had ordered from Salvador. Things like metal tools, medicine, and European cloth that couldn't be made on the ranch. During the return trip, Joaquim had time to observe the countryside with fresh eyes. He noticed how many new settlements were appearing along the cattle routes. What had been empty wilderness just a few years ago now had small towns, farms, and even some sugar plantations that were expanding inland from the coast. At one of these new settlements, called Vila Nova, Joaquim met a Portuguese colonist named Silva who was trying to establish a cattle ranch much closer to Salvador than Colonel Costa's property. Silva had bought land from the colonial government and was importing cattle from Europe to start his herd. "Why drive cattle for 3 months when you can raise them a day's ride from the city?" Silva asked Joaquim. "I'm going to cut out the middlemen and sell directly to the slaughterhouses." Joaquim listened politely, but doubted that Silva's plan would work. The coastal land was expensive and not really suitable for large-scale cattle raising. More importantly, Silva didn't understand that cattle ranching wasn't just about having cows. It was about having enough land for them to graze, water sources that wouldn't fail during droughts, and the knowledge to manage herds in Brazil's challenging climate. But Silva's comments made Joaquim think about the future of his profession. If more people tried to raise cattle near the cities, would there still be demand for long-distance cattle drives? And if the new regulations made it harder and more expensive to bring cattle to market, would it still be profitable for ranch owners like Colonel Costa? When Joaquim finally reached Colonel Costa's ranch, he found the owner waiting for him with surprising news. Colonel Costa had decided to sell his property and invest his money in gold mining instead. The cattle ranch that had been Joaquim's life for 15 years would soon belong to someone else. "The mining business is where the real money is now," Colonel Costa explained. "I can make more from one lucky strike than from 10 years of selling cattle. And I won't have to deal with all these new regulations and taxes." This news hit Joaquim like a physical blow. The ranch wasn't just where he worked, it was his home. He knew every waterhole, every grazing area, every trail across the thousands of acres. He had trained younger vaqueros, nursed sick cattle, and defended the herd against predators. Now all of that was ending. Colonel Costa offered Joaquim a job helping to establish a new mining operation in Minas Gerais. But Joaquim wasn't interested in leaving the cattle business. Mining was dangerous work that required different skills and offered a very different kind of life. Instead, Joaquim decided to try something that few vaqueros had ever attempted, becoming an independent cattle dealer. Using money he had saved over the years, plus a loan from a merchant friend in Salvador, he would buy cattle from ranchers and drive them to market himself. This was a risky decision. As an employee, Joaquim had received steady wages, whether the cattle sold for high or low prices. As an independent dealer, he would bear all the risks himself. If cattle prices dropped, if he lost animals during the drive, or if new regulations made the business unprofitable, he could lose everything. But Joaquim also understood the cattle trade better than most people. He knew which ranchers had the best animals, which routes were most reliable, and which buyers in Salvador paid the highest prices. If anyone could succeed as an independent cattle dealer, it was someone with his experience. Joaquim's first independent cattle drive began 6 months later. He had bought 200 head from 3 different ranchers, promising to pay them when he sold the cattle in Salvador. It was a much smaller operation than the drives he had led for Colonel Costa, but the principles were the same. This time, however, Joaquim was the one making all the decisions. He chose the route, decided when to rest the cattle, and negotiated, with government officials along the way. For the first time in his life, he was truly his own boss. The drive took 7 weeks and encountered several problems that tested Joaquim's skills. A drought had dried up 2 of his usual water sources, forcing a detour that added a week to the journey. Bandits attacked the herd one night, stealing 6 animals before the vaqueros could drive them off, and one of his crew members became sick and had to be left at a settlement to recover. Despite these challenges, Joaquim delivered most of his cattle to Salvador in good condition. The market was strong, and he made a solid profit on the sale. After paying his debts and covering expenses, he had enough money to buy a larger herd for his next trip. Over the following years, Joaquim built a successful business as an independent cattle dealer. He developed relationships with ranchers throughout the Sertão and with buyers in Salvador and other coastal cities. He even started sending cattle to Rio de Janeiro, where rapid growth was creating demand for beef. But the business was always difficult and unpredictable. Government regulations continued to increase, making each trip more expensive and time-consuming. Competition from coastal ranchers grew as more people tried to raise cattle closer to the markets, and periodic droughts in the interior made it impossible to maintain reliable herds. Joaquim's career as a vaquero and cattle dealer spanned 35 years, from 1705 to 1740. During that time, he watched Brazil's cattle industry evolve from a frontier business dominated by a few large ranchers to a more regulated and competitive trade involving many smaller operators. He also witnessed the decline of the traditional vaquero system. The new generation of cattle workers were employees of commercial companies rather than semi-independent cowboys. They used more modern equipment and followed established routes, but they lacked the deep knowledge of the land and animals that had made the old vaqueros so skilled. When Joaquim finally retired, he used his savings to buy a small piece of land near Feira de Santana, where he raised a few head of cattle and served as a consultant to younger men entering the cattle trade. He had lived to see the Brazilian sertão connected to world markets and the cattle business become a regulated industry. But Joaquim never lost his love for the work that had defined his life. Even in his old age, he could identify the quality of cattle with a single glance, predict weather patterns by observing animal behavior, and find his way across unmarked terrain using skills passed down from generation to generation of vaqueros. His tombstone in the Feira de Santana cemetery bore a simple inscription, Joaquim Barbosa, Vaqueiro. He knew the land and the cattle trusted him. Below that was carved a small image of a cow, representing the animals that had shaped Brazil's interior and connected its vast wilderness to the wider world. The cattle drives that Joaquim had spent his life conducting were more than just economic activities. They were the threads that wove together the scattered settlements of colonial Brazil, bringing news, goods, and people across distances that seemed impossible to traverse. The vaqueiros were among the first Brazilians to truly know their enormous country, and their roots became the foundations for the roads and communications networks that would eventually unite Brazil into a single nation. By the time Joaquim died in 1755, the age of the great cattle drives was largely over, but the culture, knowledge, and traditions of the vaqueiros had become part of Brazil's identity, influencing everything from music and literature to political attitudes and social relationships. The men who had walked behind cattle across an unmapped continent had helped create the Brazil that would eventually become one of the world's major nations. Governor Luis César de Menezes was hosting the most important dinner of his career, and everything had to be perfect. It was November 1705, and 15 of the most powerful men in colonial Brazil would soon gather around his dining table in the governor's palace in Salvador. The future of Portuguese control over this vast territory might depend on the conversations that took place over this meal. The governor's cook, a free mulatto woman named Benedita, had been preparing for this dinner for 3 days. She commanded a kitchen staff of 12 people, slaves, servants, and specialized cooks, all working to create a feast that would impress guests accustomed to the finest European cuisine while showcasing the unique flavors that Brazil had to offer. You might think that cooking for important people in colonial Brazil would be simple since there were no restaurants to compete with and no food critics to please. But actually, these formal dinners were incredibly complex political and social events. The food served, the way it was presented, and even the order in which guests were served all sent messages about power, wealth, and colonial relationships. Governor Menezes represented the Portuguese crown in Brazil, but his power depended on the cooperation of local plantation owners, merchants, and military commanders. Many of these men were far wealthier than the governor himself, owning vast estates and hundreds of slaves. The dinner was his opportunity to remind them that he spoke for the king while also showing respect for their local influence. Benedita understood these politics better than most people realized. She had been cooking for colonial officials for 20 years and knew that a poorly planned meal could harm diplomatic relationships or business deals. She also knew that the wrong choice of ingredients could accidentally insult someone's regional pride or religious beliefs. The guest list for tonight's dinner reflected the complex social structure of colonial Brazil. There would be Portuguese, nobles who had been sent from Europe to govern the colony. There would be Brazilian-born Portuguese, called criollos, who owned large plantations but were often looked down upon by European-born Portuguese. There would even be a few successful merchants of mixed race, whose wealth had bought them acceptance in high society despite their ancestry. Planning the menu required balancing European expectations with local realities. The guests expected dishes they would recognize from Portugal, roasted meats, fine wines, elaborate desserts, but many European ingredients were impossible to find in Brazil, while local ingredients that were delicious and nutritious were often viewed with suspicion by people who associated fine dining with European traditions. Benedita solved this problem by creating dishes that combined familiar European techniques with Brazilian ingredients. For example, she planned to serve roasted beef prepared in Portuguese style, but using cattle raised on Brazilian grass and seasoned with pepper and herbs, found only in the New World. The centerpiece of the dinner would be a whole roasted pig, stuffed with rice, nuts, and tropical fruits. This dish required skills that Benedita had spent years perfecting. The pig had to be cooked slowly over a fire made from specific types of wood that would add flavor without overwhelming the meat. The stuffing had to be seasoned perfectly and cooked to exactly the right texture. But before guests could even see the main courses, they would be served a series of smaller dishes designed to stimulate appetite and provide opportunities for conversation. These included fresh oysters brought in barrels from coastal waters, pickled vegetables prepared according to European recipes, and small portions of exotic Brazilian fish prepared in ways that European palates could appreciate. The kitchen where Benedita worked was unlike anything that existed in Europe. Built around a large courtyard with multiple cooking fires, It was designed for Brazil's tropical climate. There were areas for different types of food preparation, one section for baking bread, another for preparing meats, and a third for making the elaborate desserts that colonial society demanded. Getting all the ingredients for the dinner required a network of suppliers throughout the region. Fresh fish came from coastal villages, delivered by canoe and ox cart. Fruits and vegetables came from gardens maintained by religious orders and private estates. Spices came from ships recently arrived from India and Africa. Wine came from Portugal, carefully transported in barrels, designed to survive months at sea. Some ingredients were more exotic than others. Benedita had arranged for several dishes featuring Brazil nuts, which grew only in certain parts of the Amazon and had to be transported hundreds of miles to reach Salvador. She had also planned to serve a dessert made with crystallized pineapple, a technique that had been developed by Portuguese nuns in Brazil but was still unknown in Europe. The dinner would be served in the governor's formal dining room, a large space decorated with furniture imported from Portugal and artwork depicting scenes from Portuguese history. The table itself was made from a single piece of Brazilian hardwood, so large that it had taken 8 men to carry it into the room when the palace was built. Each guest's place at the table was marked not just by fine china and silverware, but by complex rules of protocol that determined who sat where. The bishop would sit at the governor's right hand, representing the Catholic Church's authority in the colony. The richest plantation owner would sit at his left, acknowledging the economic power that such men wielded. The serving of the meal would be an elaborate performance involving dozens of servants. Food would be brought to the table on silver platters, presented to the governor for approval, and then served to guests in strict order of social precedence. Each course would be accompanied by appropriate wines, and the entire meal would be served with musical entertainment provided by enslaved musicians. As the afternoon wore on and the dinner hour approached, Benedita made final inspections of every dish. She tasted sauces to ensure they had the right balance of flavors. She checked that meats were cooking properly and that desserts had set correctly. She coordinated with the head servant to ensure that each course would be ready exactly when needed. The pressure on Benedita was enormous. If the dinner succeeded, the governor would gain prestige and his guests would leave satisfied with their treatment. Portuguese-Brazilian relations would be strengthened, business deals would be made, and colonial policies would be discussed in an atmosphere of goodwill. But if anything went wrong, if the food was poorly prepared, if guests were offended by unfamiliar ingredients, or if the service was inadequate, the consequences could be serious. The governor's authority could be undermined, important relationships could be damaged, and Benedita herself could lose her position and possibly her freedom. As the sun began to set over Salvador's harbour and the first guests started arriving, at the palace, Benedita put the finishing touches on the most important meal she had ever prepared. The first guests began arriving at the governor's palace as church bells rang 6 o'clock. Through the kitchen windows, Benedita could see servants lighting torches and lanterns throughout the reception rooms. The palace came alive with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and musicians tuning their instruments. Bishop Dom Fernando Soares arrived first, as was proper for the highest religious authority in the colony. He was followed by Colonel Antonio da Silva, the wealthiest sugar plantation owner in Bahia, who owned over 800 slaves and land that stretched for miles along the coast. Next came Captain Manuel dos Santos, a shipowner whose vessels carried sugar and tobacco to Europe and brought back manufactured goods and wine. Each guest was greeted personally by Governor Meneses and offered a cup of spiced wine while they waited for the others to arrive. This reception period was crucial for establishing the evening's tone and allowing the host to gauge his guests' moods and expectations. In the kitchen, Benedita orchestrated the final preparations like a general commanding troops. She had divided her staff into teams, each responsible for specific dishes. The meat cooks tended to the roasting fires, while the pastry cooks put finishing touches on elaborate desserts. Servants polished silverware and arranged serving platters with mathematical precision. The first course was the most challenging to execute properly. It consisted of multiple small dishes that had to be prepared fresh and served immediately while still hot. There were tiny meat pastries, fried plantain slices, fresh bread with several types of spreads, and small portions of coconut soup that had taken Benedita years to perfect. The serving process itself was an intricate dance. 8 servants carried large silver trays into the dining room, where they presented the food to Governor Meneses for ceremonial approval before serving the guests. The governor would nod to indicate his satisfaction, and then the servants would serve each guest according to strict protocols of social rank. Benedita watched anxiously from behind a screen where she could observe the dining room without being seen. She studied the guests' reactions to each dish, noting which items they seemed to enjoy and which they barely touched. This information would help her adjust the remaining courses. The conversation at the table was as carefully orchestrated as the food itself. Governor Meneses guided the discussion through topics designed to showcase his knowledge of colonial affairs, while allowing each guest to demonstrate their own expertise. They talked about sugar prices in European markets, the latest news from Portugal, and the ongoing conflicts with indigenous peoples in the interior. Between the first and second courses, there was a brief intermission during which guests could walk around the reception rooms and admire the governor's collection of art and furniture. This gave Benedita's team time to clear the table and prepare for the next round of serving. The second course featured the roasted pig that was the evening's centerpiece. The entire animal was carried into the dining room on a massive silver platter, garnished with tropical fruits and accompanied by several side dishes including rice cooked with saffron, vegetables seasoned with Brazilian spices, and a sauce made from cashew nuts that was Benedita's own creation. Carving the pig required skill and showmanship. The governor's head servant, a Portuguese man named João, who had served in noble houses in Lisbon, performed this task with theatrical precision. Each guest received a portion carved according to their status, the choicest cuts going to the most important visitors. As the guests ate, Benedita noticed subtle signals that told her how the dinner was progressing. When Colonel Silva complimented the governor on the excellence of the cashew sauce, she knew that her innovative combination of Brazilian and Portuguese cooking styles was succeeding. When Bishop Suarez asked for a second helping of the saffron rice, she felt a flush of pride in her team's execution. But the dinner wasn't just about food, it was about the complex negotiations that took place between courses. During a pause in the meal, Captain Santos mentioned that pirates had been attacking Portuguese ships near the African coast. This led to a discussion about naval protection for Brazilian trade that would influence colonial policy for months to come. The third course showcased Brazil's tropical abundance. There were fresh fruits that most Europeans had never seen: mangoes, papayas, and passion fruit arranged in artistic displays. There were also more substantial dishes, including fish prepared with coconut milk and spices, and a casserole made with hearts of palm that was both exotic and familiar to European tastes. The wine served throughout the meal told its own story about colonial Brazil's place in the Portuguese Empire. Red wine from the Douro Valley in Portugal was paired with meat dishes, acknowledging the guests' European heritage. But there was also a sweet wine made from Brazilian grapes that had been developed by Jesuit missionaries, representing the colony's growing agricultural sophistication. As the evening progressed, the conversation became more relaxed and more revealing. The guests began discussing sensitive topics like the treatment of indigenous peoples, the regulation of slave labor, and the growing tensions between Brazilian-born and European-born Portuguese. These conversations would later influence gubernatorial policies and colonial legislation. Between the third and fourth courses, entertainment was provided by a group of musicians. Both European and African instruments created a unique colonial sound that all the guests recognized as distinctly Brazilian. The music provided a soundtrack for informal conversations as guests moved around the room and formed smaller discussion groups. The fourth and final course focused on sweets and desserts that demonstrated the sophistication of Brazilian sugar production. There were European-style cakes made with local ingredients, crystallized fruits that showcased Brazil's tropical abundance, and various confections that combined Portuguese techniques with Brazilian flavors. One dessert in particular drew attention. A complex creation made with layers of cake, custard, and fruit that Benedita had designed specifically for this dinner. It required precise timing and temperature control to execute properly, and its success demonstrated the high level of culinary skill available in colonial Brazil. As the meal concluded, Governor Menezes rose to offer a toast to King Pedro II of Portugal and to the continued prosperity of Brazil. The guests raised their glasses of Brazilian-made cachaça liqueur, symbolically acknowledging both their loyalty to Portugal and their pride in their colonial achievements. The dinner had lasted nearly 4 hours, and by its end, important business had been conducted. Agreements had been reached on trade policies, alliances had been strengthened among the colonial elite, and Governor Menezes had successfully demonstrated both his authority and his respect for local interests. But for Benedita, the real measure of success was simpler. Every guest had eaten well. No one had been offended by unfamiliar foods, and the dinner had contributed to the kind of political stability that kept colonial society functioning smoothly. As the last guests departed, the governor's palace near midnight, Benedita finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that she'd been holding back for hours. The dinner had been a complete success. Guests had complimented every course, important business had been conducted, and Governor Menezes had achieved his political goals. But now came the enormous task of cleaning up after the most elaborate meal of the year. The kitchen looked like a battlefield. Every pot, pan, and serving dish had been used, some multiple times. Grease and sauce stains covered the work surfaces. The fires that had burned all day were finally allowed to die down, but the heat they had generated would keep the kitchen uncomfortably warm until dawn. Benedita's staff worked through the night to restore order. Servants washed dishes in large basins, scrubbed pots with sand and soap, and swept food scraps that would be fed to the palace's pigs and chickens. Nothing was wasted in colonial Brazil. Even the bones from the roasted pig would be used to make soup for the servants' meals. The leftover food from the dinner represented a small fortune. There was enough roasted meat, rice, and desserts to feed dozens of people. But in colonial society, sharing leftover food from elite dinners was part of a complex system of social relationships. Portions would be distributed to servants, sent to religious orders as gifts, and shared with neighboring families as gestures of goodwill. Governor Menezes came to the kitchen personally to thank Benedita for her work. This was unusual. Most colonial officials would simply send a message through an intermediary. But the governor understood that his political success depended on people like Benedita, whose skills made him look sophisticated and generous to his guests. "You have outdone yourself, Benedita," the governor said. "The cashew sauce alone was worth a dozen diplomatic meetings. Colonel Silva has already asked me for the recipe to share with his wife." Benedita smiled at the compliment, but knew she would never reveal all the secrets of her cooking. The cashew sauce had taken her years to perfect, and it represented knowledge that gave her value and security in colonial society. As long as she could create dishes that no one else could duplicate, she would have a place in the governor's household. Over the following days, news of the dinner spread throughout Salvador's elite social circles. The wives of the guests shared descriptions of the food with their friends, often embellishing details to make their own social connections seem more impressive. The governor's reputation as a host grew, which translated into political influence and respect. But the dinner also had consequences that Benedita could observe from her position in the governor's household. The agreements reached during the meal led to new policies regarding trade and taxation. The alliances formed between guests resulted in business partnerships that would shape colonial economic development for years to come. 1 month after the dinner, Governor Menezes announced new regulations for colonial commerce that directly reflected conversations from that evening. Taxes on imported European goods would be reduced, making it easier for merchants like Captain Santos to conduct business. But taxes on internal trade would be increased, affecting plantation owners like Colonel Silva, who sold products within Brazil. These policy changes revealed the complex negotiations that had taken place over Benedita's carefully prepared courses. The dinner hadn't just been a social event. It had been a forum where the most powerful men in colonial Brazil worked out the compromises that kept their society functioning. Benedita understood that her role in these negotiations was more important than most people realized. By creating an atmosphere of hospitality and comfort, she had facilitated discussions that might have been impossible in more formal settings. The generous food and wine had helped guests relax their guards and speak more openly about sensitive topics. As winter approached and the social season in Salvador intensified, Benedita found herself in constant demand. Word of her cooking skills had spread, and other wealthy families tried to hire her for their own important dinners. Governor Meneses had to increase her salary and benefits to keep her from accepting other offers, but the higher status came with new pressures. Every dinner Benedita cooked was now compared to the legendary meal she had prepared for the governor. Guests arrived with high expectations that she had to meet consistently. One unsuccessful meal could damage her reputation and reduce her value as a cook. Benedita also began training younger cooks in some of her techniques, though she was careful not to share all her secrets. She realized that her knowledge represented not just personal skill, but cultural heritage. The dishes she created blended African, Portuguese, and indigenous Brazilian influences in ways that reflected the complex evolution of colonial society. 6 months after the governor's dinner, Benedita received an offer that surprised everyone, including herself. A wealthy Portuguese merchant wanted to take her to Lisbon to cook for his family there. The salary he offered was extraordinary, and the opportunity to see Europe was something most colonials could only dream about. But after considering the offer carefully, Benedita declined. She had realized that her skills were specifically adapted to Brazilian conditions and ingredients. In Portugal, she would be just another cook trying to prepare European food. In Brazil, she was an artist, creating something unique and valuable. Instead, Benedita decided to open her own small business, preparing food for special occasions throughout Salvador. She used her savings and a loan from Governor Meneses to rent a house with a large kitchen near the city center. From there, she could cater private dinners for the colonial elite, while also serving simpler meals to middle-class families. The business succeeded because Benedita understood something that few other cooks grasped. Colonial Brazilian cuisine was becoming its own distinct tradition, separate from both European and indigenous food cultures. People wanted dishes that reflected their unique position as Portuguese colonials living in a tropical environment with African and indigenous influences. Benedita's cooking represented the broader evolution of colonial Brazilian culture. Just as Brazilian Portuguese was developing its own vocabulary and accent, Brazilian cuisine was developing its own flavors and techniques. The dinner she had prepared for Governor Meneses had been more than just a meal. It had been a statement about what it meant to be Brazilian. When Benedita retired in 1720, she had trained dozens of cooks and influenced the development of cuisine throughout colonial Brazil. The recipes she created and the techniques she developed continued to be used in wealthy households across the colony. More importantly, she had helped establish the idea that Brazilian food could be sophisticated and distinctive rather than just a poor imitation of European cuisine. The governor's dinner of 1705 was remembered in Salvador society for decades, not just because of the political agreements reached there, but because of the food that had made those agreements possible. It represented a moment when colonial Brazil's cultural maturity was expressed through the universal language of hospitality and shared meals. By the time Benedita died in 1735, the cooking style she had pioneered had become the standard for elite Brazilian tables. What had started as her personal interpretation of how to feed powerful Portuguese colonials had evolved into a cuisine that helped define Brazilian identity. The woman who had worried about whether her cashew sauce would be acceptable to European palates had ended up creating a food tradition that would survive long after the colonial period ended. Today, Many of the dishes that Benedita created or adapted can still be found in Brazilian cuisine. The combination of European techniques with tropical ingredients, the use of African spices and cooking methods, and the incorporation of indigenous foods all reflect the work of colonial cooks like her, who had to create something new from the diverse elements of their complex society. Francisco de Melo Paleta was standing on his small hillside farm outside Rio de Janeiro in 1727, holding a handful of small green beans that everyone said were worthless. The beans had come from a plant that most Brazilians had never seen, brought from French Guiana through circumstances that Paleta preferred not to discuss in detail. But he was convinced that these coffee beans would transform Brazil into the richest country in the Americas. Most people thought Paleta was crazy. Brazil had built its wealth on sugar, and everyone knew that sugar was the crop that made fortunes in the New World. Coffee was something that rich Europeans drank in fancy houses, not something you could grow profitably in the tropics. The Portuguese colonial government was so focused on sugar production that they actively discouraged farmers from trying other crops. You might wonder why anyone would risk everything on an unknown plant when sugar plantations were making their owners incredibly wealthy. But Paleta had seen something that others missed. The growing demand for coffee in European cities, the perfect growing conditions in Brazil's highlands, and the opportunity to break the French and Dutch monopoly on coffee production. Paleta's journey to French Guiana had been officially diplomatic, but practically commercial espionage. As a Portuguese military officer, he had been sent to mediate a border dispute between French and Portuguese territories. But his real mission was to obtain coffee plants that the French had been successfully growing in their South American colonies. The French guarded their coffee plants like military secrets. They knew that coffee was becoming increasingly popular in Europe and that controlling its production meant controlling enormous profits. Anyone caught smuggling coffee plants out of French territory faced imprisonment or worse. Paleta succeeded in his mission through a combination of charm, luck, and romance. According to the stories he told in Rio's taverns, the wife of French Guiana's governor had fallen in love with him during his diplomatic visit. When he departed, she secretly gave him a bouquet of flowers that concealed coffee seeds inside the stems. Whether or not this story was true, Paleta returned to Brazil in 1727 with coffee plants and a plan to revolutionize Brazilian agriculture. He established his first coffee plantation on land he owned in the hills outside Rio, where the elevation and climate seemed ideal for coffee cultivation. But growing coffee was completely different from growing sugar. Sugarcane was a hardy plant that grew quickly and could be harvested within a year of planting. Coffee plants took 3 to 5 years to mature before they produced their first harvest, and they required careful attention to soil conditions, rainfall, and temperature. Paleta had to learn everything about coffee cultivation through trial and error. He experimented with different planting techniques, trying to figure out how far apart to space the plants and how much shade they needed. He tested various fertilizers, most of which were just animal manure and compost made from plant waste. The first few years were discouraging. Many of his coffee plants died, apparently for no reason. Others grew but produced very few beans. Paleta began to wonder if the climate around Rio was really suitable for coffee, or if he was simply not skilled enough to make the plants thrive. Local farmers and colonial officials were openly skeptical of Paleta's experiment. They pointed out that he was spending enormous amounts of time and money on plants that might never produce anything profitable. Meanwhile, sugar plantation owners were getting rich with every harvest, buying more land and more slaves to expand their operations. "You're wasting good farmland that could be growing sugar," his neighbor Colonel Santos told him. "Even if your coffee plants survive, who's going to buy coffee beans in Brazil? People here drink chocolate or wine, not some bitter black liquid that Europeans have developed a taste for." But Paleta had done his research. He knew that coffee consumption in Europe was growing rapidly, especially in France, England, and Holland. Coffee houses were becoming popular meeting places in major cities, and the price of coffee beans had been rising steadily for decades. More importantly, Palheta understood that Brazil had advantages that existing coffee-producing regions lacked. The climate was ideal, land was relatively cheap, and labor was available through the slave system. If he could successfully grow coffee in Brazil, he could undersell the French and Dutch producers and capture a huge share of the European market. By 1730, Palheta's coffee plants were finally beginning to produce significant harvests. The beans were small but flavorful, and when he had them roasted and brewed, the resulting coffee was as good as anything imported from French colonies. But proving that he could grow coffee was only the first part of his challenge. The second challenge was processing the coffee properly. Unlike sugar, which could be refined using techniques that Portuguese colonials had perfected over generations, coffee required specialized knowledge that few people in Brazil possessed. The beans had to be harvested at exactly the right time, processed to remove the outer fruit, dried under specific conditions, and then sorted by quality. Palheta spent months learning these processes, often by experimenting with small batches of beans and comparing the results. He discovered that coffee processing was as much art as science, requiring judgment and experience that couldn't be learned from books or instructions. The third challenge was finding buyers for his coffee. The Portuguese colonial trade system was designed around sugar exports, and there were no established networks for marketing coffee to European consumers. Palheta would have to create his own distribution system, or convince existing merchants to add coffee to their operations. In 1732, Palheta harvested his first commercially viable coffee crop, about 2,000 pounds of beans that he had carefully processed and sorted. He arranged for a merchant friend in Rio to ship the coffee to Lisbon, where it would be sold to importers who supplied European coffee houses. The results exceeded Palheta's most optimistic expectations. European buyers were impressed by the quality of Brazilian coffee and eager to purchase more. The price they paid was high enough to make coffee cultivation extremely profitable, potentially even more profitable than sugar production. Word of Palheta's success spread quickly through Brazil's agricultural community. Suddenly, the man who had been dismissed as a dreamy gambler was being sought out for advice by some of the colony's wealthiest plantation owners. Everyone wanted to know how to grow coffee and whether their land might be suitable for cultivation. But as other farmers began experimenting with coffee cultivation, Palheta realized that his initial success might be short-lived if he couldn't maintain advantages over his competitors. Within 3 years of Palheta's first successful coffee harvest, dozens of wealthy Brazilians were rushing to establish their own coffee plantations. Colonel Santos, who had mocked Palheta's experiment just a few years earlier, converted 300 acres of his sugar estate to coffee cultivation. Even some sugar mill owners began growing coffee on the hillsides that were too steep for sugar, cane. Palheta watched this transformation with mixed feelings. He was proud that his gamble had succeeded and that Brazil was becoming a major coffee producer. But he also knew that increased competition would drive down prices and reduce his profits. He needed to stay ahead of the other coffee farmers by improving his methods and expanding his operations. The key to successful coffee production, Palheta discovered, was selecting the right land. Coffee plants grew best on hillsides with good drainage, rich soil, and protection from strong winds. The altitude was crucial, too low, and the plants wouldn't develop the complex flavors that European buyers valued. Too high, and they grew too slowly to be profitable. By 1735, Palheta had expanded his plantation to over 500 acres and was producing more than 20,000 pounds of coffee per year. But managing such a large operation required solving problems that no Brazilian had faced before. How many workers? Did you need to harvest coffee efficiently? What was the best way to dry thousands of pounds of beans without losing quality? How could you process coffee quickly enough to meet shipment deadlines? Unlike sugar production, which used large numbers of enslaved workers in gang labor, coffee cultivation required more skilled and varied work. During planting and weeding seasons, workers needed to handle individual plants carefully. During harvest time, they had to pick only ripe cherries, leaving unripe ones for later. And during processing, experienced workers had to monitor drying and sorting operations that could make or break the final product's quality. Palheta began developing new techniques for managing coffee workers. He assigned specific workers to become specialists in different aspects of coffee production. Some became expert at recognizing when coffee cherries were perfectly ripe. Others developed skills in operating the machinery that removed fruit from beans. A few became master roasters who could test small batches to ensure quality. These innovations made Palheta's plantation more efficient than his competitors, but they also created new challenges. Skilled coffee workers were valuable and harder to control than field hands who performed simple, repetitive tasks. Some of Palheta's best workers were enslaved people who clearly understood that their knowledge made them valuable and who occasionally used that leverage to negotiate better. Treatment. The rapid expansion of coffee cultivation also created environmental problems that no one had anticipated. Clear-cutting forests to plant coffee caused soil erosion on steep hillsides. Streams became polluted with water used to wash coffee beans. And the intensive cultivation required by coffee plants depleted soil nutrients much faster than the more extensive sugar cultivation. Palheta tried to address these problems by developing more sustainable farming practices. He experimented with leaving some forest trees among the coffee plants to prevent erosion and provide shade. He created settling ponds to treat wastewater from coffee processing, and he began rotating crops on some of his land to restore soil fertility. But the most significant challenge facing Brazilian coffee production wasn't agricultural or environmental. It was political. The Portuguese colonial government was becoming concerned about the rapid growth of coffee cultivation and its potential impact on the established sugar economy. Colonial officials worried that too much focus on coffee would reduce sugar production and threaten Portugal's position in European sugar markets. They also feared that coffee's higher profits would attract more foreign attention to Brazil and potentially lead to increased smuggling or even territorial disputes with other European powers. In 1738, the colonial government imposed new regulations on coffee production. Plantations had to be licensed, coffee exports had to be approved by royal officials, and a special tax was levied on coffee shipments to Europe. These measures were designed to control the growth of the coffee industry and ensure that it didn't undermine Portugal's colonial economic strategy. Palheta found these new regulations frustrating and economically damaging. The licensing process was slow and expensive, often delaying planting seasons. The export approval system created bottlenecks that could cause coffee shipments to miss important market opportunities in Europe. And the new taxes reduced profit margins significantly. But the regulations also had an unintended consequence. They drove innovation and efficiency in the coffee industry. Plantation owners like Palheta had to streamline their operations to maintain profitability despite increased government interference. This led to improvements in processing techniques, better organization of labor, and more sophisticated approaches to marketing. Palheta also began forming partnerships with other coffee producers to share costs and resources. A group of plantation owners jointly hired agents in Lisbon and other European cities to handle coffee sales directly, bypassing traditional colonial merchants who took large commissions. By 1740, Brazilian coffee was becoming well known in European markets for its quality and reliability. Coffee houses in London, Paris, and Amsterdam specifically advertised that they served Brazilian coffee. This reputation allowed Brazilian producers to command premium prices despite the political obstacles they faced. The success of coffee cultivation was also beginning to change the social and economic structure of colonial Brazil. Unlike sugar, plantation owners, who were often absentee landlords living in cities or even in Portugal, coffee producers tended to live on their estates and personally manage operations. This created a new class of rural landowners who were deeply connected to their properties and local communities. Coffee regions developed different social patterns than sugar areas, with more social mobility and greater interaction between landowners and workers. Coffee cultivation also attracted immigrants and internal migrants who saw opportunities in the expanding industry. European immigrants with agricultural experience came to work as overseers and technical specialists. Brazilians from other regions moved to coffee areas seeking employment or their own small plots of land. By 1742, 15 years after Paleta had planted his first coffee seeds, Brazil was producing over 2 million pounds of coffee annually. The crop had become the colony's second most valuable export after sugar, and in some regions it was already more important economically than the older industry. Paleta, now in his 60s, had become one of the wealthiest men in Brazil. His plantation produced over 50,000 pounds of coffee per year, and he owned interests in coffee trading companies in both Brazil and Europe. But his greatest satisfaction came from knowing that his original gamble had transformed Brazilian agriculture. However, Paleta was also beginning to see signs that the coffee boom might face new challenges. Increased production was starting to drive down prices in European markets. Other tropical regions were beginning to establish their own coffee cultivation, and tensions between European powers were affecting international trade in unpredictable ways. The man who had bet everything on an unknown crop 15 years earlier now faced the challenge of ensuring that his success would continue in an increasingly complex and competitive world. By 1750, Paleta's original bet on coffee had transformed Brazil in ways that no one, including himself, had anticipated. The hillsides around Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo were covered with coffee plants as far as the eye could see. What had started as one man's experiment with a few smuggled seeds had become an economic revolution that would eventually make Brazil the world's largest coffee producer. But this success brought new challenges that tested everything Paleta had learned about agriculture and business. European demand for coffee continued to grow, but so did competition from other coffee-producing regions. Jamaica, Ceylon, and Java were all expanding their own coffee cultivation, and each region claimed that their beans were superior to Brazilian coffee. Paleta responded to this competition by focusing on quality rather than just quantity. He invested in better processing equipment, including new machines for hulling and sorting beans that produced more uniform results. He also developed relationships with specific coffee merchants in Europe who specialized in premium coffee for wealthy customers. The most significant change in Paleta's operations came when he decided to establish his own coffee trading company in Lisbon. Rather than selling his coffee to middlemen who then resold it in Europe, he would ship directly to his own warehouses and control the entire process from plant to cup. This vertical integration required enormous capital investment and sophisticated management. Paleta had to hire agents in multiple European cities, maintain warehouses, arrange shipping, and handle currency exchanges across different countries. But it also allowed him to capture much more of the profit from each pound of coffee he produced. By 1752, Paleta's coffee empire extended far beyond his original plantation. He owned or had partnerships in 12 coffee estates throughout Brazil, operated warehouses in Lisbon, London, and Hamburg, and employed over 300 people in Brazil and Europe. The man who had started by secretly planting a few coffee seeds was now running one of the first multinational agricultural businesses. But managing such a complex operation revealed problems that Paleta hadn't anticipated. Communication between Brazil and Europe took months, making it difficult to respond quickly to market changes. Currency fluctuations could wipe out profits from entire shipments, and political tensions between European countries could disrupt trade routes without warning. The labor situation on coffee plantations was also becoming more complex. As plantations expanded and specialized, they required workers with different skills than traditional agricultural laborers. This led to a more stratified workforce, with skilled specialists earning better treatment and sometimes even wages alongside enslaved field workers. Paleta began experimenting with different labor arrangements to attract the skilled workers his operations needed. He offered some enslaved workers the opportunity to buy their freedom through years of specialized labor. He hired free workers as overseers and technical specialists. He even brought some European immigrants to Brazil to serve as experts in coffee processing. These innovations made Paleta's operations more efficient, but they also created social tensions. Traditional plantation owners criticized him for disrupting established racial and social hierarchies. Colonial officials worried that his labor practices might encourage unrest among enslaved populations on other estates. The environmental impact of coffee cultivation was also becoming apparent by the 1750s. Decades of intensive farming had depleted soil on many hillsides. Deforestation had led to increased erosion and changes in local rainfall patterns. Some areas that had been highly productive in the 1730s were already showing signs of declining yields. Palheta addressed these problems by pioneering what would later be called sustainable agriculture. He developed crop rotation systems that restored soil fertility. He preserved forest areas within his plantations to maintain watersheds and prevent erosion. He experimented with composting and organic fertilizers to reduce dependence on imported chemicals. But perhaps the most significant challenge facing Brazilian coffee production in the 1750s was political. The Portuguese government's attitude toward coffee had evolved from initial suspicion to enthusiastic support as they realized how much tax revenue the crop generated. However, this government support came with increased regulation and interference. New laws required coffee producers to sell a certain percentage of their crop to government buyers at fixed prices. Export licenses became more difficult to obtain and more expensive. And colonial officials began trying to direct coffee cultivation towards certain regions and away from others based on political rather than agricultural considerations. Palheta used his wealth and influence to fight these restrictions, but he also realized that political conditions in colonial Brazil were becoming unstable. The rigid Portuguese colonial system was increasingly at odds with the economic realities of a complex, modern agricultural industry. In 1755, Palheta made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. At the age of 70, having built one of Brazil's most successful agricultural empires, he began planning to retire and pass control of his operations to the next generation. But he made this transition on his own terms, in a way that would preserve what he had built. Rather than simply leaving his estates to his sons, Palheta created what amounted to Brazil's first modern agricultural corporation. He established a complex ownership structure that included family members, key employees, and even some of his business partners in Europe. This ensured that his coffee operations would continue to be managed by people who understood the business rather than simply inheriting it. Palheta also established a fund to support research into improved coffee cultivation techniques. He wanted future generations of farmers to benefit from scientific study of soil conditions, plant breeding, climate management, and processing methods. This fund would eventually support some of Brazil's first agricultural research institutions. When Palheta died in 1761, Brazilian coffee production was approaching £4 million annually. The industry he had pioneered employed tens of thousands of people and generated revenue that made up nearly a quarter of Brazil's exports. More importantly, coffee cultivation had demonstrated that Brazil could be more than just a source of raw materials for European use. The coffee industry had created new technologies, new business practices, and new social relationships that would influence Brazilian development for centuries. It had shown that Brazilian entrepreneurs could compete successfully in global markets, and it had proven that innovation and quality could be more important than simply following established colonial economic patterns. Palheta's legacy extended far beyond the coffee industry itself. The methods he developed for managing complex agricultural operations influenced other crops and industries. The business relationships he established between Brazil and Europe created new patterns of international trade, and the social changes that resulted from coffee cultivation contributed to the gradual transformation of Brazilian society. By the time Brazil gained independence in 1822, coffee had become the foundation of the new nation's economy. The profits from coffee exports would finance railroads, cities, and industrial development. The coffee regions would become centers of political power and cultural innovation. And the agricultural techniques pioneered by men like Palheta would be adapted for dozens of other crops. But perhaps most importantly, Palheta's success with coffee had demonstrated something crucial about Brazil's potential. A country that many Europeans saw as a backward colonial territory could actually lead the world in producing crops that required sophisticated agriculture, complex processing, and international marketing. The man who had gambled on a handful of smuggled seeds had helped prove that Brazil belonged among the world's most advanced agricultural nations. Today, Brazil produces over 3 billion pounds of coffee annually, more than any other country in the world. The hillsides that Palheita first planted with coffee in the 1720s are still covered with coffee trees, now managed by farmers who use techniques he would recognize alongside modern technologies he couldn't have imagined. The industry he created, from a few forbidden seeds, continues to be a cornerstone of Brazilian economic life, affecting millions of people and connecting Brazil to coffee drinkers in every corner of the world.